Well, good morning. Good morning to everyone. Hello to everyone, and thank you for coming to today's event, whether you're here with us live in the room or tuning in virtually from across Canada. My name is Ian Bailey. I'm a staff reporter with the Globe and Mail in Ottawa. I'm pleased to be here today as one of your MCs and hosts. It's very nice to be back in Calgary, walking around. Had a chance to go to your Central Library last night. Very impressive. I'm a library nerd. It was quite something to see.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning and welcome, everybody. I would just like to first apologize for my voice today. I've been struggling with a bit of a cold, but thank you. I'm Willow Fiddler. I'm a national news reporter with the Globe and Mail. I work out of Thunder Bay in Northern Ontario, and I report on a number of issues that we are talking about today. So I'm quite excited to be co-hosting with Ian and moderating a couple of panels today.
Well, these events always have housekeeping rules and notes so that folks can enjoy them. I'll start with a few for those in the virtual audience to ensure that they don't miss any of the proceedings today. So I'm speaking to folks online. You can listen to the event in English and French. To change between English and French, please see the language toggle button at the top of your screen as shown on the slide. If you'd like to ask a question of the speakers or make a comment, please use the live Q&A button as shown on the right of your screen. Now, if you're having technical issues, please click the support chat button on the left. On another note, an important note, I'd like to acknowledge today we are situated on the territories of the peoples of Treaty 7. They include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Bigunji, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation within Alberta.
We're going to be opening and closing today's event with a traditional knowledge keeper. So I'm honored to be introducing knowledge keeper Cameron Crowchild, who will be conducting the opening and closing ceremonies today. Cameron Crowchild was born on this side of Turtle Island near the Elbow River, an area known today as Calgary. He was raised within the Tsuut'ina Nation, surrounded by the language, traditions, and teachings of his people. Cameron's early learning was guided by the late hereditary chief Peter O'Cheese of the Hinton Foothills Ojibwe, whose teachings laid the foundation for his lifelong passive learning. He continues to expand his knowledge through the wisdom of the current hereditary chief, Jimmy O'Cheese of the Foothills Ojibwe, and his father, Tsuut'ina elder Alex Crowchild, along with many other respected elders across Turtle Island. Please welcome knowledge keeper Cameron Crowchild. Okay.
I can't hear myself. Okay. The wow nanaskaman an sigasun kashuation. Nia ochi suit inna aya Bekisque when nehiawi when masquachis my late nikawi sipisco agua chahpan ogimao Chief Bobtail is on my mother's side. On my father's side, we go back to Ontario with the great chiefs from the out east. So I was asked to come up here and to share some information that I carry. As you can tell, I'm middle-aged. I'm not elder yet, but I have knowledge. I have some information that I've earned. I've gone to ceremonies. I've lived our traditional ways with our elders from Tsuut'ina, and right across this country I've traveled and accumulated the knowledge that I have, that I carry. So what I want to share is the importance of, well, first of all, e kachina was given to me, and it opens the door to knowledge and understanding traditional denate tsut in our ways and ninesha, our ways of knowing. So the language is connected to this tobacco, and we always offer tobacco for the knowledge from the people that carry it, or the elders, what you want and what you request. And today I will share a little bit of information on, I'll share a little bit of information, then I'll do the prayer to start us off. And I was talking earlier this morning that we are connected to the universe. That's why our hands are up here, and we have the snow, the sleet, the wind, the water, the sun, the warmth, it's connected up here. So we're connected, morning star, evening star, north star, and imithotzik, the northern lights, the sun, the moon. Everything is connected in our world view. And when you look on your phone or the computer, it's called a World Wide Web. And the non-Indigenous thinking lens, their thought is the World Wide Web. Elbow, Blackfoot. My wife's from Ghana, so she taught me some of her language. Ohkato, Big Rock, Panoka, up there, Anoka, Okotok. So the land is connected. The words are connected to these sites. And then in Anishinaabe, they call it Chicago, Mississippi, Big River. So all the languages are connected to this land, to creation. So our ties are with the land, and we're all related to the environment because we are the environment. We didn't come through the Bering Strait. We didn't come through evolution. We have our own creation and stories of where we come from and who we are and what we're about. And that leads us back to the 4 simple laws that we must follow. In the non-native way, there's laws, legislations, policies, procedures. It's all there, written laws to govern and work for the people, to keep peace and harmony and maintain that. And that's that wampum belt, the 2-row wampum belt. Their laws, their governance, their system, our canoe, and where we're going down side by side as brothers to help one another. When we need help, we help them. When they need help, we help the non-natives. And this is why we're here today, because Gayas, in Taisin, what the old people talked about in the future, all the color of man is going to be Ota on this island. And it's up to us to help the people understand the 4 laws that are simple. And I'll explain that before I say a prayer, then we can get started here. So kindness, honesty, sharing, and strength. The 4 direction laws, that's why they call us Neheo. And this is us. We touch them every day. We work with them. We wash up. We put on our clothes. And our laws are right there. The 4 directions. And it goes into our toes. Then when you take off your hat or you put on your clothes, everything's a circle. So we already knew the world was round. The sun, the moon, the earth, the lodges, everything is there. So the grass represents kindness and respect. When the education system talks, Alberta government or any education across this country, they say grass, but to us, it's a law. It represents to be kind to all people that are coming to this country, to be kind and respectful. Honesty are the trees. The trees give life. They give oxygen. They breathe. They create clouds in our worldview. This is what the elders talk about. So it creates stuff. So the trees all point to heaven to remind us to be honest. So if I'm going to go to Safeway and steal a pound of meat, I'm going to get caught, or am I going to pay for it? That's going to be honesty, right? We can't steal. That's the way the law is. So all the trees represent honesty. Our bones represent a tree. That's why our head and our ribs represent the branches, and it points straight to heaven. So we have to be honest every day and truthful. And that's where your inherent rights are given to you since creation. And then from there, the sharing, the third law, third direction, east, south, west, is the animal. Pasquamostus, we call that buffalo. He's the one that, and the moussoir, absamooses, all the four-legged, the fish and the seals that feed the people, and the bird kingdom. So all these things are sharing because that's what sustained the Nehioakota here on this island. So that was our treaty with those animals. The fourth law is the strength, or the mountains, or the rock. So we have to have a strong mind when we're getting called down by anybody at our workplace or wherever. We have to have a strong mind on that mountain. And that's what the elders talk about. You need to be strong. Pascausin, that mind. So those are the four direction laws. So if you ever remember anything today about what I'm talking about, those are our existing laws. Those are our laws since time immemorial, and they'll still be here, and that's your symbols. So I wanted to share the four direction laws and where we come from. And the sweet grass, we call it wikasqua and Cree. Nehiawiwan wikasqua. Ego tsutina gunaha. I can speak a little bit of tsutina gunaha. We call this clotlitsine. Yeah. I'll say the prayer. And these are things that the elders hid back in 1851 to 1951 that were outlawed and banned up till 1951 till we got to practice these things and use them. So remember I mentioned kindness, honesty, sharing, one braid, strength. So that's what these braids represent. And that's what this represents, the laws of the land. So I'll light the sweet grass. I'll say a prayer. And if you want, you can say your own prayer in your own mind and help out, because the more people there is praying, and the more we want good things to happen. So I'll just do the smudge and I'll say it in the language. Ayoho, ta niskaglaka. Maguta tistitin in na tlata dinate ietsut in a eagle tlata eagle ua ie dinate iet nishina gajite ichitanishina a gahalitsut in a diet in the se goja sine cashway konet Gagis mohanoch gagis ga da poemio sino dawinan semantu. We pray for Kahkio Moniawak, Se Bachuawak, Ashtewiasaka, Guanehioak, Ota Husky, and go around the world that they may find this peace and this harmony and this to work together. Ota Husky, the world, Nis Kikawinawaski, how Kamaupi Samusha Musqua, Mamo Kawimau, Kahkio Gisko Atiokan, and Witsinan, Kahkio Anotes, that the people will work together, Ota, to come up with good things. And that's what the elders talk about, Ota, Aski, Kahkio, Nehioak, elders, that things will be Miosin, that Bematsuin, that we will work together to find that harmony and that peace and that balance with everything, Ota, Husky, Hanamushum now, Gokum now, Nanaskman, Tapoe Miosin, Anochka, Giska, Nanaskman, no Tawinan. Hey, Jimmy, Gutch. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day. See you around.
A thank you to Knowledge Keeper Cameron Crowchild for opening the ceremony. We are looking forward to your closing ceremony later today. Before we start, I want to acknowledge that we're going to have some difficult conversations here today. Some of the experiences of our speakers, some tough stuff they're going to be talking about, can be very triggering to share, for them to share, and for you to hear. For those who are joining us in person, we have a decompression room on site where you can go if you're feeling overwhelmed or need a moment to regroup. A mental health practitioner is hosting in the decompression room and is available to chat if you need to talk. Staff will also be on hand to point you toward the room, and we have signage as well. There's obviously the team at the front desk if you need some direction on where to go. For those who are dialing in, who are in the virtual audience, one resource you might want to refer to for grounding is called Self-Management in the Moment. You can find it on the website for CAMH, also known as the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. The quickest way to access it is to Google Self-Management in the Moment, plus CAMH, and you should see it at the top of your search results. So let's begin our discussions, and let's go to our first topic and our first speakers. As you've all probably noticed, the federal government has is changing its immigration policies. It's reduced the number of newcomers to Canada, and there's a kind of consensus in principle on reducing numbers, both in sort of the main opposition party nationally and according to public opinion polling, there's this kind of consensus among Canadians in general as well. So we're going to have a discussion about that and talk about how these changes are having an impact on communities in Canada. We're going to be talking obviously about Calgary. And we're going to talk about solutions and remedies, thanks to our esteemed guests who will be up on the stage in a moment. First, we have Dr. Pallavi Banerjee, a professor and University of Calgary Research Excellence Chair. Welcome, Pallavi. Next, we have Dr. Francis Bochi, Executive Director with Action Dignity. Welcome, Francis. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Anne-Marie Pham, co-founder and board director with the National Council of Asian Canadians. Welcome, Anne-Marie. Oh, grab this chair. Well, welcome to everyone. I think I'd like to start with that big question. Numbers are being cut. We just had a federal budget not so long ago that puts numbers out there and puts the government's policy front and center. And Canadians, at least as measured by public opinion polling, are saying that this is not a bad thing. What do you think of that? Pallavi, we'll start with you, and then we'll work down the row.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you, Yin. Thank you, Yin, for that introduction. Globe and Mail and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for organizing this and for inviting us here. That's an excellent question, Yin. I think, and I have said this before, that when in the last few years we had a rising number of immigrants coming into Canada, propelled by the Trudeau government, it on the surface seemed unplanned, but as a sociologist, I think it was to save the Canadian pension funds, because as we know, in Canada, we have a rising aging population and not a workforce that can contribute to the pension funds. So immigrants were brought in to save our futures, right? But there was not a plan for integrating them. And because there was not a plan to integrating them, and we know this with housing, with education, in the healthcare system, where we are now is that we as a world have shifted to a very populist, nativist rhetoric that immigrants are not welcome and are not good. And we tend, and this has happened historically, we live in a settler colonial world, right? And as a sociologist, I study this. So historically, this is not anomaly. We have seen this whenever there has been an economic crisis. We are in a post-COVID world. That immigrants are squarely blamed for our domestic woes, whether they are rising unemployment or housing crisis or our schools, overcrowding of our schools. We saw the teacher strike happening here. I personally don't think curbing immigration is the way to go. Immigrants have been the bedrock and the backbone of Canada since the last, I would say, 300 years, and Canada is a settler colonial, and I want to emphasize a colonial country still. So what we are seeing in terms of curbing immigration is a hearkening back and a hearkening to those logics of exclusion and those logics of nativism and protectionism, right? That we need to save Canada for Canadians. Who are Canadians? We are all Canadians. We are the ones who have made Canada what it is today, along with our elders, our Indigenous elders, and our Indigenous knowledge keepers and land keepers. So I personally don't think that curbing immigration is where we should go, where what we should be doing is we should be thinking about how policies of the government, as well as at the local level, can better integrate immigrants who are already here and also foster a type of immigration that grows our economies, our values, and the core of Canadian values, which is humanity, kindness, and openness to all.
Thank you. Francis, I'll go to you on that general question. I mean, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much for organizing this, and Ian, thank you for moderating it as well. I work with Action Dignity, whose mission is really to work with organizations to transform society. And I think because I'm in that environment, what we see cuts in immigration do is really a sense of looking at numbers of immigrants, but not looking at the conditions that impact them when they're here. And I think that's a very big issue, because in our environment, we speak to several people. We have 175 member organizations. And when we do what we call community policy dialogues, we hear sentiments coming from these individuals about how the narrative around immigration is really creating a divide in the community. And they don't see that to be a numbers thing, like Dr. Pallavi has said. It is really about how it is conveyed, how it is narrated. And everything is blamed on newcomers in that respect. Housing, education, accessing services, and things like that. You know, my daughter was in a C train one day and somebody came up and said, "Oh, you guys are putting a strain on our health system," forgetting that we are part of taxpayers as well. And so we are beginning to see that there is overt aggression towards newcomers in that sense because of this narrative. And then there's a sense of incomplete citizenship in that sense as well, because people do not feel that they are Canadians, in spite of the fact that they've been brought here on qualified basis, where they are capable of contributing to Canada. And so this sense of incomplete citizenship is beginning to emerge amongst newcomers, immigrants, newcomers. It is also beginning to put a strain on their mental health, which is part of what racial trauma is beginning to do. Most of these individuals are getting to a place where, apart from facing employment challenges, there is also issues of public safety, a sense of unsafeness in their environments. In fact, yesterday I was talking to one of my colleagues at work from the Latino community, and she said, "Francis, what we are noticing is that there is more overt, aggressive behavior towards us in this part of the world." And that for me was a red flag around the narrative that is being propelled in this city and around Canada, and how it is having an impact on different people of our society.
Francis, I'm sorry to hear about the situation with your daughter and also the challenging times that people are facing here in Calgary. On to you, Anne-Marie. What do you think in general about this consensus that seems to have emerged on immigration?
Yeah, my fellow panelists shared a lot of really good insights, and I really concur with everything that's been said. I think that, lowering immigration levels at this time may be something that is needed for some, to sort of like help alleviate perhaps social housing, services, infrastructure, the educational system, the healthcare system. We can understand that. I think that the challenge we have right now is that there are a lot of people who are blaming the immigrants for these challenges. And like you've all said very well, you've articulated very well, we have to debunk that. And so that is, I think, the biggest issue is separating the immigrants, the newcomers, from the actual issues on the ground that have nothing to do with them. The other piece too is I want to just add a lens, of this narrative affecting the Asian community. Because if you look at the stats over the last 5 years, about 60 to 65% of all newcomers to Canada actually have come from Asia. So they average roughly between 280 to 300,000 people per year. And the top 3 sources of immigration are all from Asia for the past 5 years, being India, Philippines, and China. And so this trend has been steady for at least 5 years. What we're seeing here as well is the rise of anti-Asian sentiment, in particular the South Asian sentiment, because there's so many South Asian folks who are coming, right, for a number of years now. And that's really creating a lot of struggles and challenges within the Asian community. So I want to name that because it is a challenge that we're seeing. There's a lot of hurtful social posts, TikTok posts that are being seen by so many people, including youth. So what are we doing as a society to support, the people who are here in Canada? And of course, you can look different and you can be born in Canada, but when people see you as a visible minority, you can still be seen as a newcomer and as an immigrant. So I think lots of discourse needs to happen around that. And now I'll add one last thing, is there was a report recently released by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship that talked about the leaky bucket. And maybe some of you have read this report. But basically what the report says is that Canada is really struggling to retain highly educated, highly skilled immigrants who are vital to the long-term economic strength of Canada. So highly skilled workers depart at more than double the rate of lowest skilled peers, and talent in sectors central to Canada's future, such as technology, engineering, business management, shows some of the lowest long-term retention levels. And we know that many of the Asian immigrants that come to Canada are highly educated. Not all of them, but there are many that are. And my question is, how many of those highly skilled immigrants who left everything to come to Canada and met the point system actually are finding really hard to find jobs in Canada and are leaving the country?
Thank you. We are here in Calgary, where we're not in Toronto or elsewhere. I'd like to, Francis, you spoke of specific incidents here in Calgary, but I'd like to throw the question over, like, how is this situation playing out in Calgary? What kind of pressures realities are playing out in this city as a result of this move and this consensus on immigration? Let's go again, Pallavi, like, what can you tell me, and folks who are watching who are not here in Calgary, not here in Alberta, about how this is all different here than elsewhere in the country?
I think from the work that I do with youth of color, immigrant newcomer youth of color, as well as international graduate students and international students at the university, in Calgary, there is a growing and simmering fear among all racialized newcomers that we are going the way of our southern neighbors, right? That we are not that far away from not only this deep anti-immigrant and anti-racialized people sentiment, but we are very close to authoritarianism. If it could happen there so quickly, it can happen here, right? And we know that when political ideology and political will changes, then a moral core of a nation state can change overnight. And this has been, this is historically true. We are seeing it at this historical moment. So what I would say to this is that when, as you said, Ian, that the political rhetoric and the political will, as well as policies, are converging to being more anti-immigrant or at least stopping immigration. And what that does is it empowers and it basically gives voice to sometimes fringe groups to come into action and act out, as my esteemed colleague here was saying, to both at the institutional level exclude racialized people, but also we see this happening on the streets. So some of the young people, young youth we work with who are Muslim, who wear the hijab, they have come and reported to us that they were on the public transit and their hijab was pulled out, and this has happened in the last few years. There is extreme racism against Black kids, Black girls and boys in their educational institution, where they are being diverted to vocational paths instead of more intellectual paths. There is a devaluing of immigrants' contributions to the society. And who are suffering? It's the young people who are suffering. I want to end this with something that I predicted in 2022 when my book came out. I said that in my book that Trump is no longer in office in 2022, who was not in office. But the future globally is Trumpian. And what I meant by that is that what we are in a historical moment where we are living an authoritarian, anti-minority, anti-immigrant world. We are contending with that world. And if we are to, protect our futures, protect the futures of an equitable future for this country, we need to really contend and come face to face with that we are shifting rightward, right? I would end with that.
Francis?
Yes, I think when I was reading the Canadian government's anti-racism strategy, something that struck me was really the emergence of transnational hate groups and how that is really kind of having some impact actually in Canada as well. And I think this is part of a response to the narrative we are hearing from around the world, and politicians, citizens, and things like that. It is going to be a very, very interesting dynamic, knowing that these groups are targeting racialized communities, targeting racialized individuals, and that is an opportunity for them to really excel in what they are trying to do. What this is going to contribute to is really a disintegration of our communities. And that is not what we who came to Canada here stand for. We came here to really be part of building an economy, building a community that has the most impact by way of leading the world around things that we are very, very much interested in. Secondly, when it comes to what we call opportunity domains, this rhetoric is beginning to impact all those domains, whether it is education, employment, health, what have you. You'll begin to see that there's a huge impact when it comes to equitable access to all these services that are supposed to be meant for every citizen and in this particular case, every Calgarian. There is a guard around that because people are beginning to think that newcomers, racialized people, are creating shortages in the system because we are too many here in Canada.
Anne-Marie?
Yes. Let me tell you a little bit of a personal story because it reflects to where we are at today. when I was 23 years old, so quite a long time ago, my first job out of university was with the government of Canada. And I was a co-op student with them for 16 months. I had worked part-time, so there was an opportunity. I applied. I had just graduated from my sociology degree, and I got the job, and I was very excited. Within the first week at work, one of the guys on my team came up to me and said, "Congratulations, Anne-Marie. I bet you got the job because you are a visible minority, you are a woman, and you can speak French." So at the time, I was 23, very young. I just didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I just laughed it off. And I didn't think about it for a long time. You know, you're just trying to fit into your new job. You're trying your best. You're being onboarded, all of that. Now, these same comments are popping up everywhere across workplaces. And yes, there's a huge influence from the South. People are telling me, I did a presentation one time to a small group of CEOs to kind of get their feedback on the presentation that I was working on, to say how in Canada we can regain control of the national narrative around building a more inclusive Canada and what it means for all of us. And after my presentation, one of them said to me, "Well, Anne-Marie, as an Asian woman, what you're saying is self-serving and it's not going to work." And that was just a few months ago. Okay? So my story from 30 plus years ago to today is very similar. We are gone backwards, and we need to fundamentally create conditions where people of opposing party or people on the fence are able to come together to actually talk about what is diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. What is the work that all of us do here today, the meaning of it, because they're reading news that are not based on facts. They're reading, the algorithm on social media is just deepening their hole of where they're going to get information. So this is why events like finding common grounds is so important, and the work that we do in community, a lot of the work that I do with employers is so important so that we can really use the power of education and dialogue to slowly increase awareness, acceptance, and create some change.
I'd like to circle back in a moment to one of the policy issues, but something I guess we talked about, our personal stories, and you've talked about a very important, very strong story there, and how it sort of shapes your thinking on this debate over immigration. I can say my parents came from the Caribbean, England, short stint in the United States, and brought us here about the time of the first Trudeau prime ministership, and grew up in Toronto. But going along, and that's sort of the story that informs my views on immigration. But for all of you, and we'll start with you, Pallavi, like your story and how it shapes your thinking as we see numbers cut back and polls saying that that's just fine. We'll go down the table, but you first.
Sure. Thank you. So I moved to this part of the world, and not Canada. I moved to the United States in 2004 to do my PhD, and I finished my PhD in Chicago. Had my first job in Nashville, Vanderbilt University, and then eventually I moved to Calgary, Canada, to be a professor at the University of Calgary. Compared to my immigration story and all the hoops I had to jump in the United States, Canada seemed like a red carpet, honestly, at the time, because the dehumanization often that immigrants have to face at every stage in the United States is. In 2015, when I moved here, Canada seemed like a dream home, right? But that was immigration, the procedurality of immigration, right? I had everything done fairly quickly. I did not have to explain myself. I did not have to explain why I was here to be a professor, and the paperwork was done. But it was another story when I landed in the institutions that we all inhabit, which are predominantly white institutions. And as Anne-Marie said, at every stage, our qualifications, why we are here, what we do, our excellence is questioned. So I was encountering questions like Anne-Marie's all the time, and there was this one meeting I was in I think my first week of being at the University of Calgary, by an esteemed white gentleman who told me that, so I bet your job, you got this job because you are racialized, and because we no longer think about who's the best candidate, but we think about these other factors. And I answered him, well, thank God for that, because that's why we have the knowledge and the excellence that we have, that we think about what people who do not have the privileges that a lot of Canadians with citizenship and white Canadians have bring to the table. That increases our level of conversations, that increases the excellence that we have in the room as well as in our institutions. So yes, I own it, right? And so I think we should own that diversity is an asset in the context of our institutions, and true diversity, not tokenism. And beyond that, what I would say is that that's my personal story, but my personal story is also the people I work with, which is international graduate students most of my students are international graduate students. And what we have done with international graduate students right now is that, and most of them are racialized coming from the global south, that we have created a level of precarity in their lives and told them repeatedly that they don't belong here in a way that is making, as I think Anne-Marie was saying, their decision to come to Canada a living nightmare. And I think we really need to dial the course back and make sure that folks who are coming here, who are contributing their labor, their energy, their hearts to growing our institutions, are honored in those ways.
Thank you. Francis?
Yeah, so my family and I also came to Canada. I think I did my master's in Norway. I did information science, so I was a systems analyst. So I came to Canada with my family, and we were very naive at the time. Because when I was coming to Canada, one of my professor colleagues told me, she said, Francis, you are taking a very big risk. But because I had traveled to different countries, I thought it was going to be the same. And it was good that we came. The first few years were the hardest. I think I had to make some quick decisions, supported by my wife, to be able to really navigate the system here. And one of the things that was interesting was really, I started doing newspapers. I started kind of doing all kinds of things. And I was a little bit concerned about how I could use my knowledge to support the system that I find myself in. And so I had to make a quick decision. And that decision was really supported by my wife in terms of, okay, if you're experiencing all these things, why don't you go back to school? And so I began my doctoral studies in social work because I was very passionate about community work. And then at that time, I also got a job, full-time job, so full-time family. I had to navigate all these pieces at the same time, but I've had a very supportive family. But what is interesting is over the years, my family is made up of people in the medical professional here. So I began to see the impact of racism in their workplace. Imagine in 2025 going to a patient to support, and then the question you are asked, like you go in with your white colleagues, and then you are singled out, and the question is, where do we hang her? In 2025, a colleague comes to you and says, oh, I was asking to go to work, and my employer asked me, you can only come when we have difficult jobs for you. That's 2025. And then we are in 2025, where we still have, again, my family member go to a patient, and the person says, you can't touch me because you are dirty. And these things we are talking about, they are very impactful because racism is costly. Racism is expensive. Racism has its human costs, economic costs, and personal costs. There are no institutional protections for a person from my family and others who are being treated this way, coming in to support a person who needs help and getting these kinds of responses. And there's no institutional practice to suggest that, oh, we can help you. Just coming to say, oh, I'm sorry this happened to you, doesn't solve the problem. There has to be institutional arrangements where these things are not tolerated. But because those who are recipients of such abuses are not in the mainstream white category, normally there is no attention paid to how the issue is solved. And so Canada may have to graduate from a form of multiculturalism that focuses on diversity celebrations to ones that will interrogate power, equity, and then really become part of the nation-building agenda that all of us came here aiming for. Because that is the essence of building a community that has a nation-building agenda where people are cohesively working together to promote the nation's economic, social, political agenda.
Thank you, Francis. Anne-Marie, you've told us a very strong story earlier. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I have one final question.
Maybe just very quickly as well. So my story to Canada was, I came here when I was 15 years old. I was born in Vietnam, and when I was 3, a family moved to France, where my dad had a job there, and then it was the end of the Vietnam War. And then Vietnam was taken over by the communists, South Vietnam. So then we ended up being political refugees. And like many people, my dad didn't know what to do, so they opened a restaurant. So we had a restaurant business for 10 years there. When I was 15, I came to Canada, and I came from France. And everybody was like, oh, you're going to be fine. You know, you lived in France, so, you know, amongst like white people, Western people, you'll be fine. And I knew some English already. But the system was difficult. I was not properly assessed. I was put into ESL classes where I didn't really fit. They put me into the wrong grades of math and English, the lower grades, because they didn't understand the marking system in Europe is much harder, and the curriculum is more advanced than in Canada. So I had to advocate my way out of all of those things because my parents were busy running a business here. They didn't have time. They had 5 kids. I was kid number 4. So I found out very quickly that it's not easy to be seen for who you are here. I found that my best friends were immigrants like me, and that there was this invisible wall between the cool kids and the kids who were not cool. And the not cool kids were the immigrants. They were part of the not cool kids. So I think that really shaped my understanding of exclusion and inclusion, and probably is a big part of why I do the work that I do today.
Last question. I understand the Prime Minister of Canada is in Calgary today for a deal with the Premier of Alberta. If Mr. Carney was sitting in that chair over there on the left, and the leader of the government in waiting, Mr. Poilievre, was sitting in that chair over there, we'll start with you, Anne-Marie. What would you say to them about this consensus that has seen immigration numbers cut, this consensus that has seen a lot of Canadians support that? If the two of them are right there, I mean, the budget's gone. I guess the budget has passed. You know, those numbers are baked in. So if the two of them were there, very briefly, what would you say to them? And I'm going to put you on the spot, Anne-Marie. What would you say to them?
That's a good spontaneous question you're asking us. Maybe I would say, you know, now that we have a lower number of immigrants coming into our country, let's do 2 things. First is let's make sure that we provide all the tools and supports and education required to create a more equitable and inclusive society, that we address racism for Indigenous peoples and all immigrants who have been here, whether newcomers or all generations, and to not forget that together we can actually work with you to build a more united and cohesive society. And that is aligned with your mandate to strengthening society and the economy. So while there are some issues with, you know, tariffs and the economy and recession, we cannot take 2 steps backwards. We have to always look forward into how we can build a stronger Canada together.
Francis?
Yeah, so I think I will be telling the Prime Minister that Canada is in a very unique position to harness the talents, the skills and knowledge of newcomers who come to this country to help build the country. And because of that, there's need for us to really address systemic racism, because racism is embedded in systems. And because it is embedded in systems, it becomes very hard for us to really address it if we continue to fund programs that just celebrate diversity, programs that just bring us together to talk about multiculturalism. There has to be an intentional strategic approach to how we deal with racism, so that immigration doesn't just become numbers, it becomes substantive. And that I'll tell the Prime Minister to really look into how can we change the language from accepting formal equality to substantive equality. How can we ensure that these terms are converted into very tangible strategies in the workplace, really creating employment equity, equitable access to services that all of us can benefit from and be able to contribute to building the communities and the nation that we all are proud of. And the last piece I would say is for the Prime Minister to look at, really to thank him for the foreign credentials piece that has been passed. I think it's a good sign. But again, the word Canadian experience and foreign experience or foreign credentials are alien, because we are Canadians, and yet we have to have Canadian experience to be able to qualify for work. Secondly, we are brought here to work, and our credentials are foreign, but we are not foreign. And so let's have a solution, a national strategy, to really help in eradicating these barriers that are consistently putting certain citizens of Canada at a risk.
Pallavi, you have the last word with our theoretical Prime Minister.
What I'm going to say wouldn't be popular. I'm going to tell Mr. Poilievre to stop fomenting hate and dehumanization of immigrants. And I'm going to tell Mr. Carney to stop reacting to that, to not react to the right-wing rhetoric and chart a path of equity and upliftment of all Canadians, including Indigenous, Black, racialized, newcomer folks who are building our nation, who have built our nation and are building our nation. I would also I would also ask Mr. Carney to really deliver on the promise of this policy line, which he has been saying since he was on the campaign trail, that we want to reduce the number of temporary residents in Canada. That can mean different things for different people. What it means to me is those who are in this line, this perpetual line forever, please, please create a pathway for permanent residence or citizenship for those people, because they are the most vulnerable and exploited of immigrants in Canada. And to not, succumb to populist and nativist rhetoric, because that's temporary. At the core of Canadian values is where we value people, we value who we are as a country and as a nation, and to dismantle the powers that create institutional as well as interpersonal racism and build a stronger nation.
Thank you very much. Folks, I'm going to leave it at that. My colleague Willa will be up in a moment to continue with our gathering here today. We have a slide showing some links and resources mentioned by or about our speakers and their respective organizations, and we'll leave a slide on screen for a moment. Please join me, a round of applause for Plavi, Francis, and Anne-Marie for sharing their ideas and perspectives. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, folks. And thank you to you.
Thank you, Ian. And hi again, everybody. In case you're just joining us now, I'm Willow Fiddler, and I'm a national news reporter for the Globe and Mail. As Ian mentioned earlier, the conversations that we're having here today can be triggering for some. Just a reminder that we do have a decompression room on site and a mental health practitioner if you are needing a quiet space to regroup or someone to talk with. Again, my apologies for my voice. I just wanted to share a little story. In one of our pre-panel meetings before this event, one of the panelists had asked if it was okay to use the word systemic racism, because still we find so many people are uncomfortable with saying the words systemic racism and discussing it and what that actually means. And it reminded me several years ago when I was reporting on the Thunder Bay Police Service in Northern Ontario, and they had just undergone an extensive report and investigation by Ontario's police watchdog, and that report concluded and found that there was systemic racism within the Thunder Bay Police Service. So as a reporter covering that, I, of course, went to the police chief at the time in a media scrum and asked her if she was going to accept those findings of systemic racism. She refused to say those words for the longest time, and I kept hounding her until she finally said she was not accepting the findings, but that, well, yeah, I guess, accepting the findings and finally got her to say it. So, I mean, systemic racism is not up for debate here in these discussions. We know it exists. We're hearing from panelists today, how much it is affecting and still impacting their daily lives and their careers. So by discussing it, we also have to remember to take care of ourselves and each other in doing so. I am happy to introduce our next panelists. And we're going to take a couple of minutes at the end to take some questions from the audience. So if you do have any questions for this next panel, you can write them down on, I think there's cue cards or something on your tables, and there's staff that will be around, and you can hand them to the staff. And we will take your questions near the end. So first, I would like to introduce Zila Jones. She's a criminal defense, human rights, and poverty law attorney with Jones Law Office in Winnipeg. She is joining us virtually. Welcome, Zila. You won't be able to see her, but we will be able to hear her. I do see her. Hi, Zila. Next, we have Caitlin Lucas. She's the executive director with the Elizabeth Fry Society of Calgary. Welcome, Caitlin. She's coming up. And last but not least, we have Dunia Nur, President and CEO of the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council. Welcome, Dunia. So we'll start with, I'll give you three an opportunity to introduce yourselves.
Tanse.
Oh, there we go.
My name is Caitlin Lucas. I am Cree Soto Métis from the Red River Settlement. I've been in the Treaty 7 area for probably about 3 or 4 decades now. And I'm working in the Elizabeth Fry Society for the last almost 13 years. And our work is transforming to more of a focus on restorative justice than working downstream in the prison systems.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dunia Nur, and I'm joining you here from Treaty 6 territory. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. I serve as the president and CEO of the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council. I am a Muslim woman. I'm a woman of African descent. I'm African Canadian Somali heritage, and I'm really excited to have this conversation today. Thank you for having me, and thank you to the panelists before us. That was very insightful and touching, and I really appreciated every point that was mentioned.
Hello, I'm Zilla, and I appreciate being able to appear virtually. I was really wanting to be with you guys in person, but I was ill and I wasn't able to travel. So I'm very happy that I can still participate. So my name is Zilla Jones, and I am in Treaty 1, Winnipeg. I am of African Caribbean descent. I'm of mixed African, Chinese, and European descent. We're very mixed in the Caribbean. And I am a criminal defense lawyer in Winnipeg, and I also am the co-author of Canada's Black Justice Strategy, which is an initiative I'll be talking about a little more later. It's an initiative of the federal government to address the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system. And I also teach law and do much of other stuff, and I'm really happy to be here with you guys.
Thank you, everyone. So let's get right into it. Let's start with the extensive systemic racism in Canada's justice system. We know populations such as Black and Indigenous are overrepresented in prisons. There are 2 important factors to this. One of which is racism in policing, and the other one in sentencing. Zila, can we start with you? Where do you see systemic racism occurring in the policing, sentencing, and the courts?
We see that the whole criminal justice system in Canada is founded on systemic racism, and it's very much founded on anti-Black racism. Black people have been in Canada since the early 1600s, and very soon thereafter, Black people were enslaved. And so enslavement was a system that used violent control to get people to do what they were told. And the slaves' lives were governed by the slave codes, which laid out how they could be punished, what consequences they would have for things like trying to get free, trying to run away, trying to free their family, not working. And then when enslavement ended, all of that discipline and all of that punishment was put into the criminal justice system to try and continue to control people's lives so they would stay segregated, so they would stay lesser than. So our criminal justice system today still has that entire legacy where policing is often adversarial to communities and is often violent. And we see Black people overrepresented in police shooting victims. We see disparate outcomes in the justice system. We see a high over-incarceration rate of Black people in prisons, and a number of other outcomes that are discussed in our report, where Black people are not receiving the same justice as others in Canada.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Zila mentioned. For us at the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, we see the role of systemic racism and how it manifests in so many different ways. Of course, communities that are disproportionately targeted being the Black community and Indigenous community. And I really want to note that there's also diversity within the Black community, as we're not a monolith. Quite so often we forget about regional context in terms of the Black folks that are actually overrepresented within the criminal justice system. Specifically in Western Canada, they're Black Muslims, they're Black refugees, they're Black immigrants, and quite so often what happens is there's a separation between that, which is really a disservice. How we also see systemic racism play is the overrepresentation, the lack of police using discretion, the over-policing and lack of support for communities, the lack of culturally informed rehabilitative supports, the lack of community reintegration ability. And you know, when we think about Black communities and the criminal justice system, typically we look at from the perspective of accused. But quite so often what we forget is we are one of the highest numbers in terms of being victims of hate crimes and multifaceted systemic violent crimes that even makes us, our communities, susceptible to interacting with the criminal justice system. And that's what we see on a daily basis. I'll say that from both my personal lived experience and also my day-to-day professional experience as well in terms of the demographics that we're serving.
Caitlin, a similar question for you, but maybe you can start with a little update on the Elizabeth Fry Society.
Well, I think when we go back to the issue of systemic racism, it definitely has prevailed amongst Indigenous women. When you look at when our organization began 60 years ago, that women were not, Indigenous women in particular, were not primary individuals that are incarcerated. And now we're at over 50% in the federal system, 58% in the provincial system, and of course in remand. So youth also very highly populated, and our Indigenous men are at 38% as well. So I think for our work that we were doing for many years, for the first at least 5.5 decades, was focused on women in the prison system. And we were working downstream. We weren't working from the perspective of helping people to move upstream to prevent them from going into incarceration. And right now, when you look at people being triple bed booked into remand, and you're looking at the number of people that are going through the system that are Indigenous people, that we needed to kind of have a different response. So as an organization, we've been we're working with elders and knowledge keepers to focus on more of an upstream approach and working from a healing-centered cultural perspective in addressing people's matters while they're in the court system and process of being sentenced, so they can work on their healing and potentially prevent them from moving forward into the prison system.
So part of the organization's work includes restorative justice and healing as an alternative to incarceration. Can you maybe share an example of what that looks like?
Sure. Well, individuals partake in what's we call a healing plan. It's co-developed by community, by the participant, led by elder recommendations, and then the individual works on the underlying factors associated with their criminalization. And so they're working on things like trauma, grief and loss, maybe working on relationships, healthy relationships, working on addressing substance abuse issues, and addressing those underlying factors, but more importantly is that connection to culture, because many of the individuals who go through the program have been disenfranchised in some manner from their connection to their community, to their families, through multiple different ways. Even being urbanized is a situation for people not to have a connection to culture. So by regaining that sense of identity and belonging, learning language, learning the connection to culture, and having elders in their lives is a really important part of that healing plan. So we're seeing people really have better results as part of that.
Yeah, what are those results looking like?
Well, in the last 6 years, we've seen sentencing outcomes be much better. So individuals who might be seeing time in a federal institution may not actually do any time in an incarceration, but do it in the community. Maybe they've done their time already based on the hard work, because restorative justice isn't an easy way out. It's actually harder because you're working on all those issues of trauma and abuse directly in a very short period of time. So it's not the easier route that people may think, but working hard on yourself has like a ripple effect. It's like throwing a stone in the lake. You work on yourself, you affect your family, you affect your community and society as a whole, and so you are better situated to be managing your life without further criminalization. We've also noticed about a really big reduction in recidivism of people who actually finish. So our last evaluation suggested about 12.6%, which is down from 2020, which was at 37%. So seeing those kinds of results are super important. But more importantly is that reconnection to self and community.
Thank you. Dunia, when we spoke earlier, you talked about your organization's work on rehabilitation. Can you share some of what that looks like?
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to rehabilitation, we use different approaches to different community members' needs. So for example, if it's a member of our community and they are incarcerated, what we do is we put intentional programs in place, specifically programs that are co-created with the individual, also with elders from our community, and as well as therapists. And we use an African Indigenous knowledge system to ground every single thing that we do. When it comes to African Indigenous knowledge systems, we really believe that we're interconnected as a community, and we are a community that sees the world from a place of relationality. So what that means is our connection to our culture, our connection to our language, our connection to our food, our community, our families, kinship is very important. And sometimes when you have Black communities, that all those forms of connection has been disrupted due to colonial violence, enslavement, displacement, pre-migration trauma, that naturally makes a person susceptible to harming themselves or harming someone else, or even being falsely accused and being vulnerable to interacting with the criminal justice system and an act of miscarriage to take place. So with that being said, what we do is we work directly within the Remand Center. We work in EYOC specifically as a preventative measures. We work with young people. We created a rehabilitation program that's very African-centered, trauma-informed. And what that looks like is we have individuals that are working, our team, incredible human beings. And we created a curriculum with Dr. Sophie Yuhani, elders from our community, and actually individuals that rehabilitated from the criminal justice system themselves. And what we do is we teach in terms of emotional healing, and we talk about employability, cultural reconnection, and then we do it in custody. We also do it in the community. Now, we take different approaches when we do it in custody, because when an individual is in custody, we don't want to do too much emotional work. Triggering their trauma, or sometimes, as we all know, when it comes to the individuals that are in custody, jail is not a place that's safe. And unfortunately, sometimes individuals need to have their guards up for them to even survive. We see many individuals from our community, specifically Black men from our community, that actually die while they're in custody. So we're very careful in terms of the interventions and the processes of supporting them. And it would look different when they're in community versus when they're in custody. We talk a lot about housing in terms of support. What does housing look like? What does family connection look like, or reconnection look like? What does education and employability look like? What do you see for your future? How, and many of the individuals are actually, I remember they say, look, I really want family connection, but my family is not even in Canada. They're in the Dadaab refugee camp or Kakuma refugee camp. Aside from the fact that ASEC supported us when it comes to helping us and connecting us to lawyers, can you also connect us to immigration lawyers? And then later they find out that if they have a criminal offense, even sponsoring their family becomes very difficult. Or sometimes if they are a PR, which happens so often, young African Canadian youth that were probably raised here, grew up half of their life, and their family, due to various circumstances, did not apply for Canadian citizenship. And the more interaction that they have with the criminal justice system, they actually end up getting deported to a land that they don't know, a language that they did not learn, and a culture that they really didn't grow up in. So it becomes very complicated. So we use all of those different approaches to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our community. And that's for those individuals that are directly interacting with the criminal justice system and that experience criminalization. But for victims of crime, specifically what we're seeing in our community in Edmonton, Alberta, and Calgary as well, I don't know how many of you have been following, that we have a high rates of attacks against Black Muslim women. And what supports for that would look like, and not only Black Muslim women, but Black women in general, the hate-motivated attacks is disproportionately growing, and it's very concerning, and it's costly, and not only to the system, but to our community's well-being. Because when a hate crime happens, a message is sent to that community, and we hear that message loud and clear, and we internalize it in so many different ways, and it becomes a form of disempowerment, and your sense of safety, community connection, and belonging is really disrupted. So what we do for that is we have counseling programs that we put in place for women and girls that went through hate-motivated violence. We also support them in terms of the court navigation. We write a community impact letter of community impact support for the courts to understand the gravity of that violence and what it looks like. And sometimes, unfortunately, we're caught in a very interesting situation that it's not just white supremacy, hate crimes that attack our communities. Sometimes it also comes from other equity-deserving communities that they themselves have been marginalized. So our recommendation looks very differently. So that's some of the supports that we have.
I'm noticing there is a lot of similarities between Black and Indigenous people and the impacts and effects of colonization when it comes to the overrepresentation. I'm going to open it up if you guys would like to speak to that.
We were actually talking about that earlier at the table, just the parallel and the fact that the colonial history of Indigenous people, along with assimilation policies, has erased cultural ways and the impact that we have in our communities. So we see this growing intergenerational trauma that has impacted, the criminal justice system. So it's not just the criminal justice system that has impact; it's all these systems. Child welfare, the residential day school system, all of the systems that have fed into this intergenerational trauma have a huge impact on where we are in this over-incarceration and over-representation of Indigenous people. It's very similar to Dunia's community.
Zilla, would you like to weigh in on that?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, I think that both Indigenous peoples of Africa, which is what Black people are, and Indigenous peoples of the Americas, which is what Indigenous people are in Canada, both are peoples that have been colonized, and both have been colonized for a very long time. And in fact, for me, coming from the Caribbean, our region is the longest colonized region in the whole Western Hemisphere because if anybody knows, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus landed in the Caribbean. So, and there are still nations in the Caribbean that are not free, that are still colonies, right? Like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and Martinique and Guadeloupe and so many others. So we know colonialism, and it has a deep impact, just as it has on Indigenous people in Canada and the rest of the Americas. Whereas perhaps different is that Indigenous people in Canada are still on the original lands, whereas we as Black people were taken from our original lands. So our Indigenous lands are in Africa. So our existence is one of disconnect, if we're in the diaspora, and not being connected to our land, whereas Indigenous people have the experience of being on their land, but not having all their rights stripped away and not having full citizenship on their land. So there are similarities, but there are also differences. But in both cases, it leads to, as was just said, a lot of intergenerational trauma and socio-economic effects of that displacement, whether it's on your land or from your land.
Junia.
Yeah, I agree with everything my sister Zila said, definitely. And I think that when it comes to Black communities, quite so often we forget about the continent of Africa, where it all started, where the European colonizers came to our land and forcefully displaced and stole and enslaved people of African descendants. And those that remained back home, the partition of Africa, such as the Berlin Conference in 1834, which my family were victims of, and the fact that genocides and artificial border creations that resulted to the displacement of our people and our nations and our families, and the fact that it was all about extraction of resources and labor. And a lot of individuals don't also, when it comes to Africa, North America benefited from the marginalization, the exploitation, the enslavement, and the colonization of Africa till today. And when you look at her children in the context of Canada, we are overrepresented in the prison system, whether you're continental African, whether you're a Caribbean person of African descendants, or whether you are from the Black settlement community. We are all people of African descent, and it's that kinship, family ties that really bond, though our history looks different at different points in time. But really the issue of anti-African sentiments and what that looks like and how it was translated into policy and practice to harm not only the continent of Africa, but all of her descendants, whether it's in Canada or the United States or South America. We don't talk about that often, and really that is really sad. But what I will say is that there's also intersectional issues that we need to take into consideration when it comes to the Black community, which I quite often talk about. And the parallel in terms of when it comes to Indigenous communities and the Black communities, the legislation, the policies, the enactment of these policies. And there's such a strong connection. For example, when you think about the residential schools and the model of the residential schools and how the European colonizers came and took that model and took it to places like South Africa, and what healing meant and what reconciliation meant and what restitution meant, and how Nelson Mandela came to Canada and worked with many Indigenous elders, including people like the late Justice St. Clair, I think. And there's that, the way that we're oppressed is so similar, the way that we heal is so similar, but of course our community is diverse, and we are a community that goes through direct attack in terms of our language, our culture, and this false fabrication of racialization based on the skin pigmentation, and all of a sudden that creates a racial category. What that means, healing from that, and what the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council intentionally designed is to go back of what our brothers and sisters from Ghana would say, Sankofa, to return to who your ancestors are and look back at what was your ceremonies, what were your healing methodologies, how did you heal from harm, how did you repair harm, how did you hold each other accountable when members of your community harmed each other, and that's what we're doing. And then we're also really focused on human rights and policies and constitutional rights that cannot be infringed, and we're very unapologetic when it comes to standing up for members of our community when they experience that.
Thank you so much. Zilla, we're going to go back to you. Many aspects of the justice system to tackle when it comes to racism can seem like a big problem to solve, but you are working on a Black justice strategy to help in that regard. For those in the audience that aren't familiar with this Black justice strategy, what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so the Black Justice Strategy was an initiative of the prior Liberal government. So when Justin Trudeau was Prime Minister, one thing about him was that he was quite committed to solving these issues of systemic racism. And the strategy came about as a result of a lot of pressure and advocacy from Black groups in Canada, Black communities in Canada over time. So Black communities had been long speaking about overrepresentation. And interestingly enough, this came to the forefront in 2013 when the Correctional Investigator of Canada was doing his report. So the correctional investigator is kind of like an ombudsman for the correction system, for the federal correction system, and they make sure that there are no abuses, and they take some of the complaints and concerns to try and make corrections better. And they do these periodic reports to government. And in this report, they had been tasked to look at things like Indigenous overrepresentation and some other issues, women's incarceration, and Black people were not mentioned. And when he went and did the survey, he found that the fastest growing group of over incarceration was Black prisoners, and particularly in the West, in the Prairie provinces, which is interesting given that I'm in Manitoba and you're in Alberta. So our provinces and Saskatchewan in between have an explosion in Black over incarceration, and it was completely being missed and not being seen because the overall numbers weren't necessarily big, but the rates were extremely high. And the numbers were growing. And so he came back to the government and said, you need to address this. And that lined up with what Black communities had already been saying. And then to add to that, the United Nations and Amnesty had also written reports that were scathing about Canada's treatment of Black people and Black prisoners and Black people in the justice system. And it was the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent. So all of this kind of came to a head. And then, of course, in 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, which is just down the road from me here in Winnipeg. And there were protests across the country, protesting police brutality, as that also happens in Canada. We had a couple of incidents here around that time. And so the government finally acted and put together this strategy. So I was the co-author and also a member of the steering group. There were two co-authors, myself and Akwasi Uwusu-Bempah, who is a criminology professor in Toronto. They wanted to kind of spread out the representation across the country. And then we had a steering group of about 7 to 8 people who are very involved in criminal justice, Black people that are either lawyers or they work for organizations that deal with Black sentencing reports and that type of thing. And all of us had discussions along with the representatives of justice, and we wrote this report to government that lays out what we say is a framework for transforming the justice system so that it is no longer systemically racist. It has 5 pillars. So the first is the social determinants of justice. What that really is talking about how there are things outside the justice system that contribute to bringing people into the justice system. So one of the biggest ones that we found, and I should say that we consulted with Black communities from coast to coast to coast. So we spoke to organizations in each province or territory, and they held meetings or sent out surveys or got information from their members and provided it to us because we really wanted this to be community-based and based on Black voices. And what we heard from our communities was, we already knew this, but we heard it from them firsthand, was that there is a school to prison pipeline in Canada. So Black children are being disproportionately disciplined, suspended, expelled, and this is directly leading to their involvement in the criminal justice system. And we also found that Black families strongly value education and see it as a way forward for their children, but that need wasn't being met. So that plus mental health, plus addictions, plus housing problems, plus employment problems. We know that Black women are very lowly paid compared to others. What Black women earns, I think 67 cents to the dollar of a white man in Canada. And all of these factors, a lot of immigration trauma, people unable to qualify in Canada, bring people into the justice system. So that was kind of our first pillar. Secondly was policing. So we looked at police violence, police racial profiling, over policing of certain neighborhoods, all these kind of issues that happen with Black people and police. And then our third pillar was the courts and legislation. So we looked at both how people are treated in court, whether as victims, witnesses, or law professionals or accused persons. And of course, there's lots of issues with that. And many witnesses saying that they were treated as if they had done something wrong when they came to court to testify. Language barriers, lack of services for victims, because we are also overrepresented as victims of crime, not just as accused, especially in homicides. Black people are very highly overrepresented, and there's a need of services for those communities, and also legislation itself. So we looked at amendments that needed to be made to the criminal code, to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. We talked about the war on drugs, how it's harming our communities. We want more sentencing options. We want more sentencing reports. And then also there was corrections. So we looked at the use of force against inmates by guards and how that disproportionately impacts Black people, and the lack of cultural appropriate programming and services in custody. And then we looked at reintegration and reentry as our last pillar, and that looked at some of the barriers to getting parole, to being successful on parole, and more need for community involvement in the parole system. So we made 114 recommendations in our report. We also did a framework that kind of laid out the history of Black people in Canada and Black people in the legal system. That's a separate document. And all of this was presented to the Minister of Justice, and we are now in the implementation stage. So I'm now sitting on the implementation committee that just actually was meeting in Ottawa last week, trying to get the government to actually implement the strategy, which is a whole other, I think I'll be talking about a bit later. That has been a little difficult, but that's where we're at in terms of the strategy.
So what are some of the biggest barriers to implementing those recommendations?
Well, I guess we're talking now. Political will. The government has changed, and I know it's probably, I'm in Alberta, right? So I'm like, I know a lot of people are going to just roll their eyes when I say that, like we really didn't appreciate everything that the Trudeau government was doing. But they really were, I think, sincere about addressing these issues. And this government doesn't have the same political will. Our government has shifted to the right. The rhetoric has shifted to the right. There's a lot of racist rhetoric that is out there. And so we see this government just has different priorities. So when we look at some of the new crime bills that are coming out, we have the Bail Reform Act. Everybody's been saying they want bail reform. They don't want to see people getting bail as much. One of the things we talk about in our report is that the issue with the bail system is that we don't have the resources and supports for people to get bail. So we have people, and I have many clients, many of them Indigenous or Black or Afro-Indigenous, and they are being detained on breaches of their bail orders, so not even on new offenses, because they don't have a place to live, and we can't find a place to put them, so they can't get bail because they're unhoused, or they don't have sureties, they don't have cash. And we don't have addictions treatment for people that have addictions, and we don't have beds for that, and we don't have services for mental health. So people either can't get bail or they're not successful when they do get bail. And we had made that point under our social terms of justice, and yet they come out with a bail reform act that says nothing about that. It just goes to creating more barriers and obstacles to people getting bail, which is a constitutional right. To get bail, which we often forget. The right to reasonable bail is in the Constitution, and yet we have a government that is trying to deny reasonable bail and not trying to assist people in getting bail. We spoke about hate crimes. I know Dunia mentioned that. The Minister of Justice confirmed that Black people face the highest rates of hate crimes of any group in Canada, and that is any group, religious, ethnic, whatever. Whenever I share that with people, I get pushback. Well, what about this group? What about that group? Other groups are claiming that their hate is on the rise or is really high. Ours is higher. And yet they come out with Bill C9, which deals with hate symbols and hate speech, and says absolutely nothing about anti-Black hate speech. The Ku Klux Klan is not even listed as a prohibited organization in that bill. They list prohibited organizations, and they leave out things like the Ku Klux Klan and racial white supremacy groups. And my colleagues from Nova Scotia were speaking like very heartbreaking about how people drive around the streets hanging nooses out of their truck windows all the time, how people dress up as a Ku Klux Klan and flaunt it. And there is no mechanism to deal with that because we're not included when hate speech is discussed. It always becomes about other issues and pandering to different groups. So it's a little bit disappointing when we made all these recommendations of how these issues can be addressed and how you can address this overwhelming hate crimes that you even acknowledge are the highest faced by Black people in the country, and then you don't address it at all. So there's definitely a disconnect in terms of the ideology and the priorities, but I will say that we did meet with the Minister of Justice last week, and I think he heard, we were very, didn't hold back, just like I'm not holding back right now. Everything I'm saying here, I said to him, so it's not like it's behind his back. And he did say that he would be taking it into consideration and that there was more legislation coming and he would be getting back to us about that. So we are still cautiously optimistic and still trying to push and push forward.
Thank you. Many racialized individuals have extenuating circumstances, and more often than not, the courts fail to take those into account. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Caitlin, working in Indigenous communities, what are some of the contributions to criminalization?
Well, definitely the issues of homelessness, the issues of substance abuse, the opiate crisis has had a huge impact on our people. The overall lack of employment opportunities and the intergenerational trauma that continues to prevail. And I think leveraging Zila's comments about the bail reform is that most of our people are going to be the ones that are going to be staying incarcerated for longer as a result of the fact that they're having a harder time getting bail overall. So it's taking 3, 4, maybe 5 times coming back to the court system to be able to speak to the bail, and without having proper treatment opportunities, proper housing, proper opportunities for them to integrate back in, they're staying incarcerated until those situations can be addressed. And, the cost of that, you think it actually is cheaper to fix these problems in community than it is to incarcerate people at $150 to $360 a day. We could be doing a lot more to do prevention work and to overall support Indigenous people from not ending up in that system. They're going to plead, guilty to get out of jail. They're going to waive things like the GLADU in order to get out and try to find solutions for that quicker. So if we can start working more upstream to look at the preventative piece and not having breaches in administration of justice charges end up into being remanded, we're going to be a lot further ahead in supporting people and getting the help that they need.
Thank you. Dunia, you've already talked a bit about this, but did you want to add to that and what that looks like for your communities that you work with?
Yeah, I did want to add a point to, if it's okay, Bill C9, the hate crime bill. And I found that I honestly initially was very excited that this conversation was taking place. And then when I saw the bill, I found that it was more symbolic. I didn't see anything regarding anti-Black racism. I didn't see nothing regarding Islamophobia. I didn't see nothing regarding addressing the hate crimes against Indigenous people, when we know communities that are Indigenous, communities that are Black, communities that are Muslims, we barely even report to police our hate crime because we're afraid of the police themselves. And it was very heartbreaking, and I find that if there's a way that perhaps we can negotiate and figure out how to create a pathway forward of rectifying that, I think is very critical. That's the first thing that I just wanted to address for the hate crime bill.
Thank you. Zilla, we'll go back to you. You feel that data is really important to uncovering some of the issues that you've talked about, and that there's a lot of aggregated data right now. Can you talk about that and why that matters?
Yes, that was one of the foundations of the Black Justice Strategy and the work we did, because we committed to a number of principles that we wanted our report to be centered around. It had to be Afrocentric, meaning that it is centered around Black communities and Black people, as I had said. The Sankofa principle, which Dunia mentioned, which is that we move forward while looking back at our traditions and we don't forget our roots. And one of the other principles was that it must be evidence-based. So we want things in the justice system to be based on evidence, because so many things are not. Like when we talk about bail reform, there are few shocking incidents that happen, and legislation is brought in to address a non-problem. So instead of looking at what are the actual statistics on bail, and the fact that if you look at remand centers across the country, most of the people in there are not yet even convicted of a crime. And if you look at, administration of justice offenses, which is breaches of bail orders, and separate that from reoffending violent crime, you see very different patterns than what we're being led to believe is the situation. So we really wanted this to be evidence-based. And part of the reason why we don't get good evidence-based decision making is that we don't have good data and statistics on a lot of things. So specific to systemic racism, Canada keeps statistics. They keep statistics for Indigenous people, and then they keep statistics for visible minorities, right? Which is a very Canadian term. Like when I say that in the US or the UK, they don't really know what that is. And visible minorities is anyone who has brown skin that is not Indigenous. So it could be South Asians, East Asians, Arabs, Black people, Filipinos, like it's everything. So when you put all of that together in one category, it doesn't give you very useful information because some groups in that category are doing really well and don't need interventions. They are not overrepresented. And then Black people are represented in the criminal justice system, but that often gets masked or erased because when you look at visible minorities as a whole, it might not be that bad. So we get kind of aggregated in with these other groups. So one of our biggest asks was that the federal government keep statistics separately for Black Canadians. And in fact, what we had asked is that they make Black Canadians a people and do official legislation saying that we are a people of Canada. And then we recommended that there actually be a Black justice ombudsman or person that would be responsible for tracking all of this information and making sure there are services provided that match the data and what the data shows that we need. Because what we were able to pull out shows overrepresentation, but there's a lot of areas where it's unclear, there's just not enough information. And then you go back to anecdotal information, which is generally not ideal. So one of our big asks was that they keep the data separate, and they have started doing that with employment statistics. As you may know, there was a big lawsuit by Black public servants, and one of the outcomes of that is that this will be tracked as a separate category. So we want to see that happen across all sectors, provincially and federally. So we actually can see what's happening. We can see if things are working. We can see if things are not working. Another area that we really wanted data was one thing that's often recommended when people are trying to address racism in their organizations is anti-racism training. So everyone's probably heard that, let's have more training, let's send police for training, let's send judges for training. And there's very mixed data as to whether that training works. So some data suggests it doesn't do anything. Some data suggests that it can help, but it depends on the content. So it's probably a very nuanced study where you have to really look at what exactly does the training look like. Are there certain ways to do it that it's more effective? So we don't want to just recommend training across the board without being specific as to what would actually help. So we want to have data collected on those kind of things. So the point is to try and reach positive outcomes and track our progress. And we're not able to do that the way the data is collected right now. So it is a work in progress. And I think that is something that the government is doing. But as they said, it's hard to coordinate with all the provinces and all the different agencies. So it will likely take some time, but that should be a high priority.
Thank you. And I apologize, I've lost track of time. How are we for time? We're okay. We're going to have to wrap it up now. I apologize we didn't get to talk about policy solutions, but please feel free to look up our panelists and the work that they are doing on that. So I think they were going to put it up on the board. So thank you for joining us, Zilla, Caitlin, and Dunia for this fascinating discussion. Thank you. Some points in that discussion, some three takeaways. Obviously, the justice system needs to do better, taking into account the impacts of colonization, migration, trauma, and socioeconomic barriers. We need to see the recommendations from the Black Justice Strategy implemented and better data to understand what's happening at the community level in different populations, because both Black and Indigenous populations are not monoliths. They are very diverse cultures that should be recognized and acknowledged. So next up we have a networking lunch. I apologize for keeping you guys past lunch. You're probably hungry. So enjoy your lunch, and we will listen out for announcements to bring you guys back. Thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome back, everyone. Feel free to continue eating your lunch as we continue the program this afternoon. Next up, our next panel is a conversation focused on Canada's emergency response to wildfires. We know that this year we've seen record number of fires, the second worst in Canada's history for wildfires, with more than 6,000 in nearly every province and territory. Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by these fires and the evacuations that they necessitate. We have two great speakers to talk about this issue. We'll introduce them. First, we have joining us virtually is Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen. She's the Senior Fire Advisor with the Indigenous Leadership Initiative and Cultural Fire Knowledge Keeper. Amy is joining us virtually. Thank you for joining us, Amy. Hi. We have Darren Spence, a council member with Martin Falls First Nation in Northern Ontario. Welcome, Darren. How do you do it right here?
Is this on? All right, here we go.
So to get us started, we're actually going to watch a 3-minute video that looks at fire in Indigenous communities. And thank you to Dr. Amy Cardinal for providing this video. So we'll just have a look at it now.
The guardianship program is a huge step for us because it's about preserving the land and preserving culture and preserving language. It's an essential thing to our community.
A guardian acts as the eyes and ears in each respective territory. They ensure that everybody's following all the rules and regulations that are placed in all the GUI laws, our laws.
We go out and monitor tourist activities, industry activities, fisheries, commercial and sporting. We also do environmental monitoring.
A huge aspect of it is healing and getting back in touch with your Indigenous self. If there's healthy people that are happy and strong in their culture, and if they receive that from being on the land, then it's a huge investment. You're investing in a better society and a better tomorrow.
In 1973, I paddled on my own all the way down to Skungwai. All my life, I always heard it as a very strong spiritual place. There's so much brush and debris and everything all over when I got there, but it's just totally overgrown. So I took it upon myself to start clearing the village, just trying to show the ancestors that somebody cared.
Our land is very important to us. We live on it, we breathe it, we work on it. It gives us life. Without it, we don't have an identity.
The best part of being a guardian is being out on the land where your ancestors have lived for many centuries, and just to reconnect with Mother Nature and how your people lived off the land.
There's a gap between the youth and the elders. By starting this program, it's trying to bridge that gap, trying to create that spark to carry on the knowledge.
We are sustaining our traditional territory not only for us, but for the whole world. Our ecosystem is so pure, we have so many trees, that we are cleaning up a lot of pollution. It means that we are here protecting Mother Earth in order for the rest of the world to live on her.
Thank you for providing that, sharing that video with us, Amy. I will give you both an opportunity now to introduce yourselves. Amy, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Amy Cardinal Christensen. I'm a Cree Métis woman from Treaty 8 territory. I'm the Senior Fire Advisor for the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and I currently live in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta in Treaty 6, just north of where you all are. So yeah, thanks for having me, Willow and team.
Hi, Wache. Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Darren Spence. My traditional name is Gabishko Gabwit. It is Standing Strong Man. I'm from Martin Falls First Nation, Treaty 9. I've been all over this nation, working with in emergencies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. And whoever thought two little Redskins would be on the stage?
That's true.
Yeah,
Two Redskins from Northern Ontario.
In front of here on stage for all you wonderful folks. Yeah.
Thank you, Darren. I'm really excited to have both Amy and Darren here on this timely discussion. One of the main takeaways that I hope you guys get from this discussion is why it's so important for First Nations emergency response to be Indigenous-led. I'm going to start with Darren, but I'm going to give some context first. So when I was reporting on the wildfires in Northern Ontario this past summer, I did get an opportunity to travel. I went down to Toronto and where many of the evacuees were, and just to kind of see what it was like. And I remember working on that story, and I had to explain to one of my editors that these evacuations aren't like other evacuations that occur in urban locations like BC, where residents, you can pack up your car with your belongings and your pets and drive off to somewhere that's safe. That's just not possible in Northern Ontario, where there's about 40-something remote First Nation communities all fly in. So the logistics of evacuating is quite different. And I would like Darren to share some of that, Amy, as well. Just some numbers to throw out to you guys. There is a company in Northern Ontario, it's called ISN Musqueam. They're owned by the Missinaibi Cree, and they've been working on providing those First Nations-led emergency response for wildfires. This past summer, they evacuated a total of 3,130 people from 5 remote First Nations across Northern Ontario, and they were all relocated to 6 host sites. Now, most of these host sites are thousands of kilometers away from where these communities are, in places like Mississauga, Niagara Falls, even Vancouver from Northern Ontario. And that's kind of what the reality looks like. So thank you to ISN Musqueam for that information. But Darren, can you just maybe kind of go into what it looks like for these communities to evacuate?
Yeah, for sure. Emergencies in Canada are overrepresented in First Nation territories. So 82% of emergencies happen in First Nations communities. Canada spends more money on an emergency response than they do in the entirety of national defense. So it's a lot of money, and it's become big business. So when you have a business that's with an emergency management, and so the end of the day is your bottom dollar, what are the services are going to look like for when a company is trying to make the most of the services and the entitlements that a community will have. So a lot of times, at the onset of the emergency, a young family will be sent on a plane. Everyone is only able to carry 40 pounds with them, so the entirety of a family. So if we have a young family, you have children and who need diapers and who need strollers and those sorts of things, 40 pounds doesn't go a whole long way. All right, and they don't know how long you're going to be there for. You could be there for months. You could be there for hours. So you don't really know. And then the culture shock. It just simple things like crossing a road, right? Like simple things like that. A lot of these kids have never seen a traffic light, and a lot of the people, I remember, when I was in Pekanjigam. he was 19 years old, and it was his first time leaving the community. At 19 years old, and a lot of people, like it's their first time leaving their community, and they go to strange places. They go to Mississauga, we go to Timmins, and a lot of other places where all these things are very strange to them. And we've never lost anybody to a fire, in First Nation communities with wildfires, but we have lost people to evacuations. We've lost people to human trafficking. We've lost people to violence. We've lost people to there's social issues, because the host community will then inherit the social issues that community has. So now we have to build a response structure and have a system in place where the host community can now address those issues that the community then brings with them. I'm going to stop there and allow Amy to speak.
Yeah. So maybe Amy, if you can just provide a bit of context to why Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by these emergencies.
Sure. So as Darren was saying, Indigenous people make up 5% of the population in Canada. A lot of Indigenous folks live actually in urban centers. There's much less that live on reserve or in Indigenous communities, but we make up about 42% of wildfire evacuees. And so it's really concerning when we take up that proportion of people being impacted by the events, but then we are also totally kept out of wildfire management decision making. So about anything that's happening in our territory in terms of, preventing wildfires, reducing the risk before an event, including how those fires, when they start, are actually responded to, the values that are protected, how our communities are evacuated. And many times what we see is that when First Nations are evacuated, they know their community, they know the values, they know the issues, but it's often when the external folks get involved that's when lots of the issues start during these evacuation events. So for example, we had one community we worked with the First Nation Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, Lac La Ronge Indian Band, where they were doing a wonderful job with their community, getting them out, knowing the needs of people. They had certain tables and support systems. And it was only when they ended up in those kind of urban host communities where Indigenous Services Canada, the Red Cross, and other organizations got involved that then there was just such a cultural difference and such systemic racism in many of those organizations that's when many of the issues and the trauma of the evacuation came from.
Amy, staying with you and going off of what Darren was talking about a bit earlier, there's a perception that once an evacuation takes place, everything will be fine and the emergency has been dealt with. But as Darren was touching on, and you as well, there's their own trauma that it comes with. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I've heard all sorts of things, and our research, has documented them too. I think one of the most racist ones that I heard of is when there was a First Nation that was evacuated into High Level. They were given to stay in a hotel there, and then what happened was a non-Indigenous community was also evacuated at the same time, and so the First Nations community was kicked out of the hotel, those evacuees, so that the non-Indigenous folks could stay there. And so for Indigenous people, there's all sorts of jurisdictional issues that come into play. Emergency management, wildfire management are all under provincial jurisdiction in Canada, but First Nations are under Indigenous Services Canada or federal jurisdiction in terms of emergency management. So it creates just so many issues and so much complex bureaucracy when communities are already dealing with these events. And I've heard, similar to what Darren mentioned, we've heard of, drug dealers going to hotels that evacuated communities are staying in, or evacuation centers, and handing out free drug samples and getting people hooked on drugs there. We had one community we worked with where a significant portion of the adults in the community didn't return home after the evacuation because of drug and alcohol issues that occurred in the host communities.
Darren, do you want to reflect a bit on what that looks like as well?
Yeah, that happens in every, with one emergency, with the emergency of the fire, then we can start, you may as well start another emergency with the hosted capacity and what happens at that time. A lot of these communities, like Niagara Falls, they'll have their media scrums right in the parking lot. It's almost like a, advertising. Vulnerable people here, come here. Like it's very silly sometimes with some of these bureaucrats and businesses where they host and they show pictures of the evacuees, and so it's just almost like puts them on organized crime on notice that we have this vulnerable population within their city that they could take advantage of. So we have. So there's a lot of issues like that, what Amy was saying, where people are handing out free drugs, as well as some of the organized crime. They take that opportunity to recruit. It may be street gangs, it may be drug carriers, it may be drug dealers, because a lot of times when they go home, it may be $40 in say like in Calgary, but when they go home, it's like $120 for the same product. So now it's an opportunity for them to have to build their product and increase their value of their product. So they're able to recruit people to sell their drugs once they go back home, and we see that quite often. And then we see a lot of people addicted to many types of drugs and when they come back from evacuations.
Sorry, I'm lost now. Our next question. As Amy pointed out, it's Indigenous Services Canada that is responsible for these emergency measures in First Nations. So I'll ask both of you guys, how is Canada failing when it comes to these response and evacuations? Darren, do you want to go first?
Sure, I could go first. Yeah, so it starts with the entitlements that communities are allowed to provide, as well as the silos within the systems with First Nations and Inuit health benefits, with social services, Indigenous Services Canada, who write the check, who could then take quite a long time, almost years, for those reimbursement payments back to the community, who have to take dollars away from their education, from their social, from their own community health and social programs that when they're displaced. So Indigenous Services Canada is reviewing the Treasury is reviewing their entitlements this year, next year, in 2026. So I stress to Indigenous communities that to get involved, right, to ensure that like we've seen the large gaps in services for Indigenous people when they are evacuated, right? And then it's also sometimes where Amy was saying, with the large population of urban community members, where they try to get in on the services that the evacuees. So they try to get a hotel, they try to get free meals. We see unhoused people attempting to come in and join in with the evacuees, or they get the trip down to Niagara Falls or what have you. It seems to be that there isn't really a tracking system is once you're on the ban list, you're essentially gonna be on the evacuation list as well.
Amy, did you want to jump in and add to that?
Yeah, so look, I think, this is a racism thing that we're talking about here. And I think, there are a lot of good people at Indigenous Services Canada, folks that, are good. I know that they're there because they want to do a good job. But I mean, Indigenous Services Canada is a federal colonial department. It's set up to be structured in a racist and paternalistic way to Indigenous communities. And it just goes into the emergency management services that are offered. So it tends to be a lot of, we will help you, that complicated ways for communities to be able to find out, like Darren was saying, how they get reimbursed, how they even deal with an evacuation. For example, there's actually like no permanent emergency management positions in Indigenous communities in Canada. So like a city like Calgary would have people who work in an emergency management department, but unless a nation decides to do that on their own, they actually don't have those positions funded. And there has been a movement from the government of Canada realizing from the advocacy of Indigenous nations that is needed to have people in community that deal with these issues on a year-round basis. But in the recent Carney government, like that's been zeroed out for forthcoming years. And so what we tend to see the federal government do is deal with these emergencies from a really reactive and response way. So almost every emergency or wildfire that happens, it seems almost like a shock that Indigenous people and Indigenous communities are impacted. Whereas we know research tells us that this is just going to continue to increase. And so really what we need right now is like preventative risk reduction measures on the ground and making sure that communities are prepared when these events do happen.
Do you want to jump in, Darren? I feel like you've got something to add to that in terms of...
Yeah, so in regards to systematic racism, like Amy was saying that the lack of funding from municipal to a First Nation community, which is very true. Also, a lot of the systems out there are based on municipalities. A lot of the training out there is all based on municipalities. There isn't any training, even though there's a lot of, we talk about wildfires every year and flooding and in our territory where we're from, where communities are essentially get put it on a calendar that, okay, this is when you're going to be evacuated because of the flooding every year, right? And now in communities, and they understand, that they have to deal without certain things for a period of time, and that's not fair. That you have to get when you know that the very systems that was displaced for water displacement and for Ontario Hydro and all these things, there were assets that were built for provincial and federal by the provincial federal governments, then put the communities at risk. Right, that for flooding and for fire breaks and whatnot. So it seems to be that that the First Nation communities are not put that the risk assessment is not taking place, or they're not accounted for what the risk is that the First Nation community is placed in.
Right. Amy, your book called First Nations Wildfire Evacuations, A Guide for Communities and External Agencies. Can you just tell us what led you to write that book and what are a couple of the key takeaways?
Sure, yeah. So that book came about from basically when I started my career, which was quite a while ago, unfortunately now, we were really hearing about a lot of agencies in wildfire complaining about First Nations and evacuations that were having to happen and all the problems stemming from those evacuations. And my colleague, Tara McGee at the University of Alberta, we sat down together and we're like, nobody actually knows what the experiences are of First Nations evacuees. So what people are going through. So we started the First Nation Wildfire Evacuation Partnership, where we worked with over 200 First Nation wildfire evacuees from 7 different First Nations across Canada. And really in that book, documented their experiences, their best practices, and their hopes for moving forward. And I think it's important to note that when we did that research, like a lot of communities said that that was the first time they'd ever been asked actually about what happened during their evacuation, what were some of the, negative and some of the positive things. And so the book's really set up, it's not like an academic book, it's basically a book of stories and recommendations, both for First Nations and for people who work in wildfire evacuations. And I think for me, the most important thing was lots of the people we sat down with, even though their evacuation might have been, just the summer before or 5 years before, they still carried a lot of trauma from those evacuation experiences. And not because of the wildfire, like Darren was saying, but because of things that happened during the evacuation. And the reason they wanted to participate was to make it so that communities wouldn't have to experience what they experienced in the future.
Darren, just going back to what you were talking about a bit earlier, can you maybe speak to a bit about what Indigenous communities need to do to better prepare, plan, and execute when wildfires occur?
Yeah, so provided funding to do community emergency management plans and also to practice that community emergency management plan. But a lot of First Nation communities are going from crisis to crisis to crisis. That when you're in crisis, it's hard to get ready for the next crisis because you're constantly chasing the next crisis, right? So it seems where we're from in the Treaty 9 territory, they just claim a state of emergency over the drug use and the amount of suicides that are occurring in our communities. And it's just not for Treaty 9. It's not unique, but it's also all territories that we find that in order to prepare for the fires, we almost need to have that funding available to the communities in order so they can prepare for the fires and the floods, right? And have Indigenous people like myself who were essentially just thrown into I was basically thrown into emergency management. I got a phone call at 4 a.m. in the morning saying that from my boss that said, hey, we got 400 people on their way from Pekanjigam to Thunder Bay. I'm like, oh great, where are we going to put them? She's like, I don't know. Where do you think we should put them? Right? So that's how I was introduced to emergency management, right? And I was developing a policy and an operational structure for crisis response for Nishnawbe Nation at the time. So it was, that's how I was introduced to Indigenous Services EMAP program, who have all these. So in Ontario and BC and Alberta, it's legislated, right? But in other communities, there are other territories like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the emergency management is not legislated. So you don't have services within those own provinces to serve the First Nations communities, right? It's outsourced to Red Cross, who this year probably made trillions of dollars, just on emergency management and the mismanagement. I got a call from the National Chief Cindy Woodhouse. Called me at 11 p.m. at night. He's like, Darren, we really need your help in Manitoba. Can you please get on the next plane and come help us? Right, so 8 o'clock the next day, I was on my way, and there was people everywhere, and it was completely unorganized, and they were completely unprepared. And because the provinces are like, well, it's not our problem, right? And it's the First Nations problem, right? And they're not looking to help at all. And and people were turning away and whatnot. It was really sad to see how our Indigenous people were treated at that time, how they were received by the cities, and that it was really sad that even though these people are coming into the communities looking for help, that they're turned away, right? And that's part of that systematic failures.
Thank you. Amy, what are the best ways to build the capacity and resources needed for these communities?
Yeah, so I mean, I work for Indigenous Leadership Initiative, so our thing is all about Indigenous leadership in these areas. And what we see with fire, with flooding, with other emergencies is that we treat them as a seasonal problem. And again, we're very reactive to them. And the whole idea of having guardians, like fire guardians, is one thing I really advocate for. That's having people employed in First Nations, by First Nations, year round to focus on things that matter to them about fire. And lots of people say, well, there's not enough for communities to do for a whole year around fire, but really it's actually about healthy landscapes, and fire is one of those ways that we can achieve that. And so many Indigenous nations in Canada have a history of using cultural burning practices or other fire practices on the landscape to help reduce their wildfire risk and for many other cultural objectives. And so when we're advocating for fire guardians, those are the type of practices that we're advocating for, is to bring back cultural burning, to bring back Indigenous leadership during fire events and emergency management, emergency planning, to bring back education of our people in our cultural ways of, doing and stewarding our landscapes, to be in a much better relationship with fire. And considering climate change and all the other things that we're experiencing, this is so important to do. And we need to stop treating it as this, problem that can be dealt with in the summer by just throwing a few firefighters on the fire line. This is a huge problem in Canada. The smoke impacts are massive on the general Canadian public, and we need to start addressing it and funding it as the problem that it is. And that's one thing that we feel really will help is, in each community having fire guardians. And we've seen numerous groups. So the Blood Tribe has just established their first fire guardian program, where they have guardians working in fire year round. They've done their first cultural burning. The Prince Albert Grand Council now has a youth guardian program that they're running. And so we just saw the government investment of $250 million to basically lease 4 aircraft. And, we could fund every single nation in Canada to have a guardian program for that amount of money. So it's really about, where we need to be making investments and stop continuing to rely on kind of these racist, colonial, old ways of thinking about handling hazards.
So that'll bring me into my next question on the latest federal budget. If you can provide a reaction to that, how it relates to wildfires in Indigenous communities. Darren?
Yeah, so we already talked about lack of funding and lack of infrastructure in First Nation communities to deal with emergency management and to deal with emergency services. So by 2030, there's going to be no funding whatsoever in regards to for communities to deal with fire. So they're deleting the Fire Smart program, which a lot of that is an allotted amount of money for First Nation communities to develop plans for their community to prepare for fires, do fire breaks, to asset protection. For a lot of communities, we have schools, we have homes that very that costs a lot of money, right? Where it would be, let's say, where it costs, we're seeing astronomical amounts of cash in order to build these houses, and we have a housing crisis within First Nations territories, and so we're not going to, so that's going to be unprotected, for about the assets, the people, and then the territory with itself, but fire is good for the environment, right? So we need to understand that as well, that we cannot stop all the fires because we do need the fire in order to protect our environment as well.
Thank you, Darren. Amy, do you want to just quickly jump in on that? Anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think that, Darren got it. I think that it's this whole thing of being stuck in, it's like many things, right? Like I just heard the conversation on with jails and stuff like that too. And it's so similar where we put all this money into reactive or the after effects of things happening. And so when we've looked with ILI, we looked at the amount of money that the government of Canada has put in to basically contribution agreements. So not actually responding to fires, but just, to things around fire events. And so we found that the government actually has invested about $790 million in that. But only about 5% of that funding goes to Indigenous communities. And of that money that's actually going to Indigenous communities, it's all reactive. So it's mostly for training firefighters or for recovery after a fire has impacted communities. And I think, all that we're really asking for is investment in our communities before these things happen. And one thing is that it's actually really hard to prove that economically. So for example, if you're doing a great job stewarding the landscape around your community, you don't have a fire impact your community, it's hard to show the benefit to the government of doing that, because when they're responding to a wildfire, they can see budget lines. It's much easier for them to say, we spent this much money and we saved this community because of the direct impact of the fire at that time. So we really work on this social return on investment with our Guardian programs. And that's where we're really looking at, all the preventative things economically that putting Guardian programs in communities doing. And so it's cultural returns, it's social returns, it's other economic returns as well that, are really beneficial for communities. And, I talk a lot negative about fire, but I think I am in this because I see a lot of hope in us being able to have a much better relationship with fire in Canada. Like Darren said, we're never not going to have fires. So we need to really change how we're dealing with them. And one way is through, really investing in Indigenous people in leadership roles here.
Thank you. We are out of time, but I am going to throw one last question to you, just because this is an event focused on our policy solutions. So Darren, quickly, if you can tell us new or improved policies to better support Indigenous communities with wildfire prevention and emergency response.
To go to the grassroots, right? We're going to talk about training, to have those, to universalize or indigenize training modules out there, to also to recognize that Indigenous response within our clan system. We have, I believe that, we take that into account as well. So in order to have that that knowledge that to come to not only for us, but as well as the emergency management practitioner, knowing what having that cultural awareness training as well would be a good idea. Because when I say that, the very first time I went to an emergency management conference in Ontario, where they were planning for the fire and flood season, it was all white people and all in white shirts and all these acronyms and all these other positions. They were called chiefs and they were called chief this and chief that. And I was I'm looking around the only room and I'm the only chief there. Right, so they're talking about how we're going to respond to our Indigenous people, how we're going to build an operation structure for our Indigenous people. It's almost like they were owning us in some sort. So having that structure, having that training on both ends, right? So we could somehow come in and kind of meet in the middle and join in one circle with emergency management.
Thank you, Darren. Amy?
Yeah, so for us, because of the systemic racism that exists within government, we've really found great partners in philanthropic groups. And so with Indigenous people, because we have sovereignty, we have autonomy, we have inherent rights over land, what we've found is really partnering with these philanthropic groups who also support the type of Indigenous leadership that we're looking to obtain in fire. That's really been where we found really good success. So it's looking almost at, things that we don't normally maybe consider as funders or really good partners in this area. We also have an initiative called the Thunderbird Collective, which is a national working group on fire that has all these different aspects. But anyways, you can go to thunderbirdcollective.ca. Our new website's launching soon, but our grant program there just closed. And with that, it's grassroots based. Communities basically apply to us on what they need in their communities. And so we're funding all sorts of really exciting initiatives again, and hoping that that really encourages communities to keep coming forward, keep working with the Thunderbird Collective and other groups on, these innovative ways that we can steward our lands better to help reduce the impact of these fire events on our communities.
Thank you so much. We are out of time.
Sorry, Willow, we took your time for audience questions for your first discussion. We're going to give you that time back.
Okay.
So we have time for a couple. If anyone does have a question, please jot it on a cue card and we'll get it up to Willow. There's one that we have already in. Indigenous and immigrant populations make up 30% of Canada's population, yet the current system primarily benefits the majority. How can we work together to create a more equitable Canada for everyone?
I'll take that one. So I was saying earlier, to having a system that would to universalize our response plans, right, as well as to ensure that each and every we respected each and every nation out there, their identity, and as well as their unique needs. That it I have seen it where with I'm gonna go with Flin Flon, right, that where there was a community there was different types, there was a very multicultural community. And when they were evacuated, some of the community members were essentially left behind because of their cultural needs, right? So we had some people that, like, you don't eat French fries, right? You don't eat beef, you don't eat pork, right? So those sorts of things as well need to be addressed. So we need to ensure that that we respect everyone's identity.
Amy, did you want to answer that as well, or?
Amy had to drop off. So
okay.
I think
sorry.
we're good. Thank you.
Well, it was great to have Amy here. We will wrap that up then. Thank you for those questions. And again, thank you to Dr. Amy Cardinal and Darren Spence for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We have a slideshow that will have a few links up to organizations and resources related to the information just shared by Amy and Darren. To summarize a few of the takeaways from this discussion, Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by wildfire emergencies. Racism is part of that problem, along with underfunding of resources. That's like straight across the board, I think. We need to restore Indigenous approaches and practices like cultural burning and land management to help prevent the wildfires for cultural revitalization. And we need to do better approaches to evacuations that are culturally appropriate and trauma informed. So thanks again to those two speakers today. I am now going to hand it off to my colleague, Ian. There he is.
Well, thank you very much. And now we go into our final discussion, which is going to focus on the rapidly evolving issue of using artificial intelligence, or AI, to create and distribute misinformation of hate. I will say that in the planning for this panel, it's a very disturbing learning experience, and I think you can find it very interesting. Our group will help explain how it's happening, why it matters, and what we can do about it. And so let me introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Emily Laidlaw, who is the Romanescu Visiting Scholar on Anti-Hate Speech with the University of Ottawa. She's also the Canada Research Chair in Cybersecurity Law at the University of Calgary. And welcome to Emily. There she is. We'll also have, definitely a round of applause. We'll also have Dr. Gideon Christian, who's an associate professor and university research chair for AI and law with the University of Calgary. And there he is, yeah. Yep. Welcome to Gideon. And last but not least, we have Eamon Kroon, who is a machine learning scientist with the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute. And welcome to Eamon as well. There you are. We're gonna get into some details and policy here, but I have one question for all three of you, and we'll work our way down this way. And it's this question: what scares you the most about the use of AI and the distribution of hate? What chills you the most? And Emily, we'll start with you, and then we'll go on down.
I mean, that's a hard question, and So I come at it from the perspective of being a lawyer, and I'm always looking for, well, what is the rule in law, and how can we solve this from that perspective, and what are the limits of the law in helping here? And AI is challenging all of this because it becomes this easy attack vector. It takes hate, and it's on steroids, and it ends up embedding in it through so many different layers that the systemic source of it becomes invisible, and also the solution space becomes diffuse and much more difficult to handle. So what we're seeing right now is a normalization of an environment of hate, and the tools that we need to be able to address it are so complex because it's about looking at a healthy information ecosystem, and that requires, working with communities, it requires education, it requires changes to laws, and all of this needs to happen at the same time, and it also requires everyone around us to take on a responsibility about how they engage with the world around them, and right now that seems to be being interfered with through AI.
Thank you very much. Eamon, your thoughts?
Yeah, I feel like what scares me the most is humans, not AI, just because AI is just a tool that amplifies what's inside us, and it's a tool, it's like one of the tools that just makes it easier to propagate that and amplify that. But it surely is a powerful tool, and sometimes I'm worried that we will get to a point where it's hard to know if a content is generated by AI versus a human, although a human will always be behind the scene directing that content. But as a consumer of that content, if I cannot differentiate what's human-generated versus AI-generated, it just makes it more scary.
Thank you. Gideon?
So there are two aspects of AI that's kind of a combination of which scares me most when it comes to proliferation of online hate, and that is generative AI and algorithmic AI. A combination of these two will yield a result kind of similar to what Eminem referred to in rap culture as a tornado meeting a volcano. That's very devastating. And how does this happen? With generative AI, you can produce high-quality, impactful hate content at a fraction of the cost it probably will have taken some years back to produce the same content. So cheap, high-quality production of hate content made possible by generative AI. Then algorithmic AI makes possible targeted amplification, giving that content the wildest circulation possible. Not just, circulating it to the entire world, even to those who don't have any interest. But algorithmic AI basically targets individuals or people who will feed on that hate content, those who have appetite for it. And algorithmic AI here, of course, is that tool that logs behind when you are conducting your online search, watching your YouTubes and all these social media. It basically learns what you like and what you dislike. So when you have this hate content produced, it basically targets people whose online history has shown them to kind of have appetite for that content, and it feeds them. So this is a very important issue that I kind of feel alarmed because of its possibility to help in amplification of online hate contents.
There may be the temptation to think of this as, I've listened to you all, as a science fiction, as something coming around the corner. But my impression is that is not the case, and I'll throw it open. Does anyone want to, this is here now, and how is it here now? And how is it coming into our phones and our iPads and such? Let's go again. Emily, do you want to speak to that?
Yes, and I don't know if maybe an easy way to do this is to explain the ecosystem of how hate spreads online. And I think, Gideon, I'm kind of piggybacking on what you've so thoughtfully set out. So when we look at the ecosystem, we're wondering, like, why has everything gone so sideways? A lot of it is the structure of social media, and it's structured as an emotional space where, you know, the content that's pushed up by the algorithm is emotional content, and sometimes that's choices by the companies. I mean, Meta, for example, was rating angry and love reactions to content as 5 times more important than likes. Well, guess what's going to be pushed up? But also humans tend to just like more emotional content. So the rage culture, the hate culture gets spread more actively through that. But on the other side of it is what impacts people. And so we've talked about it often as kind of mimetic warfare. It's cognitive warfare that we're seeing, where if it's intentional, we're looking at hate groups. We could be looking at foreign states like Russia that just want to sow distrust. And they're injecting into the environment hate content through things like short snippets like videos, memes. And these are emotional, they're easy to digest, they're visual, they're wonderful for hate. You add on top of that AI, where it's able to produce essentially mis and disinformation, and it spreads like wildfire. So you basically inject, you amplify, you spread, and then what this can start doing is being not decision-making, but decision-shaping for real-world violence, and we're seeing that. I mean, CSIS just had a report out that said 1 in 10 of kind of investigations into violence and violent extremism is youth. Part of what's tying into that is this kind of cognitive undermining of our society, right? It's this disintegration of social cohesion. So I just want to say one thing and I'll pass it on, which is, you know, you mentioned the idea of AI and it being a tool, and one of the big challenges is how do we help people identify truth from falsity? But the additional layer here is what's actually going to work, because what we're finding is that the reaction often of people now is to say, well, I know it's not true, but it's illustrative of what I feel. And so it ends up not even mattering that we correct the truth. So the solutions right now are reacting to a tech that is just accelerating and changing so quickly, and we still don't know. We don't know the impact of deepfakes on society. We don't know what precisely is going to work to make things better, and that is probably actually more my deepest fear at the moment.
Eamon, I'm going to come back to you because I want to talk about you about a project you were involved in, but I'll go to Gideon first. This is not science fiction, right? I mean, what could you say to that?
No, it's not. I mean, this is real. We're seeing it, we're experiencing it. But I don't want to kind of, make everyone scared, because I just want to point out here that these tools are not designed solely for the purpose of, proliferating hate content. These are amazing tools that has amazing societal value, but it's just that, sometimes they could also be used by individuals who have some nefarious objective in spreading their hate objective. And I give you a very good example. In 2016, Microsoft developed an AI chatbot known as Tay. Tay stands for Thinking About You. This was basically an innocuous AI tool that was designed to interact with humans by way of tweet. When you tweet to it, it tweets you back. Tay started as an amazing tool that was saying amazing things about humans because of its interaction with people. But suddenly, Tay was kind of indoctrinated and radicalized by hate groups online who started tweeting anti-Semitic stuff about it. Tay moved from an amazing tool that was saying amazing things about humans to become a sexist, racist, Holocaust-denying, and genocide-supporting AI tool. And within 24 hours of its deployment, Microsoft pulled the plug on it because it basically learned hate from online interaction with people who have the objective of basically propagating race. So this is one important thing about AI tools, that is even tools that are designed for legitimate societal good could actually be utilized for some nefarious objective of proliferating hate crime.
Well, it sounds pretty scary to me, but Eamon, you have told us about a project you were working on with the, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing it, the PPQ1 Pele TAC1. Could you tell us about that project? Because you've sort of been on the front lines of this subject.
Yeah, like Pepikwan, and like maybe just a quick comment on the previous topic, because I feel like AI has been around since the 1990s and the 80s. But the reason for, like one of the reasons for this explosion, it's just because back in the days you had to be technical to be able to use AI. But with the rise of generative AI, anyone can use AI. So you don't have to have that technical background to be able to use it, which allowed more actors, right, like both good and bad actors to utilize that tools and amplify it. But talking about Pepikwan, that's kind of like an example where AI could be used for good. So this basically, Pepikwan is an indigenous-led company to elevate indigenous voices. And a couple of years ago, they came to my team and they had this problem of like hate speech. They talked to us about how the indigenous community is facing a lot of hate speech, especially online, and how it's affecting them mentally and physically. And they were asking, can AI help us address that? And I remember Shani, she's the CEO of that company, saying something around the line, sometimes people are racist and I just want to block them. But other times, just people are ignorant and I would like to educate them. So we came up with this idea where we can build a Grammarly-like tool where, let's say that you're in the receiving end of a hate speech. The tool will basically block that comment or post. But if you're someone who's writing about the indigenous community, and if you happen to write something intentionally or unintentionally that is biased or ignorant, this tool will basically highlight that for you, tell you why it is biased or racist, why is it hate speech, and then if it's possible, rewrite it for you. And that is a tool that you can have as a plugin that you can use as a writer, or you can use it when you're typing a comment in social media, or writing anything about the indigenous community. But yeah, and it's been a great success, and they actually started their own startup out of that won the MIT Silver last year, and it's been amazing to see them carry on the work.
We have, thank you very much. We have a minister of AI now, which is a Canadian first. I want to ask you about what difference that makes, or what that opens up in terms of responding to these concerns. We've seen the Prime Minister also talk about AI. There's a good interview in Toronto Life magazine in the last few weeks where he doesn't address hate, but he sort of talks about Canada dealing with AI and making the most of AI. But that question, what difference does it make to have a minister of AI on these matters? Emily, I'll start with you.
Yes, and I know Gideon has something very important to say on what the structure has been on AI, and so I will say this: we do need a minister on AI. I'll say on a practical level, where we find that there are challenges is that the tech. If we're looking at it as online hate as having a certain element of tech solutions, then what right now is we're seen as hot potato in a way, because it's bouncing between different bodies. You're looking at either federally ISED, you're looking at Canadian Heritage, Department of Justice, now an AI minister. Who's in charge of it? Are we talking as a privacy problem? Are we talking about hate? Are we talking about just platform regulations? What is it we're talking about? And that's just federally, not thinking about the way that this filters down to a provincial role. So do we need an AI minister? Yes. The challenge is the focus is so much on innovation. AI is, this is a perfect example about how AI and tech is such a key part of the solution space here, but it is not just about AI, it is about creating the right safeguards. And we've talked about generative AI here, and how it basically was launched, and we're the experiment here. We were having so many instances, and especially I do a lot of work too in child protection issues, and where individuals essentially have been prompted into psychotic breaks, committing suicide, other types of harms because of what is generated over a long period of time through these conversations with generative AI, which are basically immersive experiences, and yet we don't have guardrails around it except for basic narrow privacy law. So yes, we need an AI minister, but it's part of this larger ecosystem. And unless we look at it in terms of an ecosystem and there's real leadership about what responsible innovation looks like, that is technology for society, I have many choice words to say about where this might be headed.
And Gideon, what do you think of the new minister and his work?
So, Ian, I mean, if we're having this conversation 6 months ago, I'll probably say I was at the highest level of my optimism then, but we're having it 6 months later, and it happens to be at the point where I'm at the lowest level of my optimism when it comes to regulating AI in Canada. I think 6 months ago when a minister was appointed for this position, I took up my pen and paper and wrote an op-ed in the Hill Time, basically touting this as a game changer coming from Canada, appointing a minister specifically dedicated to that portfolio. But that optimism kind of quickly started to dissipate because the first interview that was granted by the minister was that, look, Canada is concerned about the economic benefits of AI, that Canada is going to stop, to use his word, over-indexing AI harms, AI warning and regulation. And that came to me as a surprise because as a Black scholar who have, for the past almost 10 years now, been working on racial bias in artificial intelligence technology, I was expecting that a regulation would be able to balance the economic benefits of AI as well as social harm AI poses to communities, especially my community, the Black community, but I never saw that happening. And of course, in September, we saw the minister set up the Canada AI Task Force, 27 experts, very distinguished experts in this field. I mean, as somebody who has been working in this field and who has written and raised concern about AI harm, I was very happy to read that. In fact, I began preparing my submission to that committee. I now went online to look for, because my submission, of course, has to do with the racial bias aspect of AI. So I went online to look at this membership of this task force to identify, okay, who is the Black member of this committee I could make my submission through. And I never found any. I had to write to the minister's office. I was like, can you please tell me which of these individuals self-identify as Black? And the response I got was that, well, as of date, no member of the committee has self-identified as Black. And that came to me as a root shock. Why would we in 2025 set up a task force to regulate AI technology, and the racial group that is most adversely impacted by racial bias in AI is not even represented in that task force? That to me was really concerning. You know, I had to coordinate 60 Black scholars to write an open letter to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Artificial Intelligence raising this serious concern. Immediately we sent that letter. Suddenly, a Black person was appointed in the committee. No, don't laugh yet, because the worst is yet to come. The Black person that was actually appointed to this committee was a Black student who have no background on AI. And now imagine appointing 27 experts, top experts in Canada. There's no Black person. Then we complain about absence of Black person. Then you just pick up one student and add to the committee. Okay, now we have a Black person. I just wrote an op-ed in Policy Option yesterday, clearly indicating reason why I actually have to boycott submission to that committee, because I did not feel represented.
Has there been any indication that this is being dealt with, that a qualified a Black participant has been recruited to work on this committee? I mean, here we are, November 27th. I checked my watch for the 27th. Has this matter been addressed at this point?
The task force ended its consultation last month, so we've not had any other development in that, arising from that yet. Whatever consultation or report from that consultation has not been released.
And what is the consequence if things just carry on?
Well, the consequence is huge. Like I noted earlier, I have spent almost a decade. My research in the last decade has basically centered on identifying racial bias. And it's so sad, because almost every sector I have researched with regards to the use of AI in banking, in health services, in criminal justice system, in immigration, in HR and employment, where this tool has been deployed. When you search for racial bias in this sector or this tool used in this sector, you will always find one. And that to me is concerning. That is what I basically spent my whole day researching, and that's what keeps me awake at night. Now, why will we not take this step in at least addressing this harm this tool poses to the communities? This is something that I think we should take seriously, and it's not just something we pay lip service to.
I want to allow for some questions on this. We're running out of time, but I do want to just squeeze one last question before we throw it to the floor. People may leave here concerned about this situation. Whose responsibility is it to deal with the issues concerning issues that you guys have raised in the last half hour or so? If anyone want to address that question, like there's the Minister of AI, there is a Justice Minister, there are the provinces, but who do you think is responsible for taking this on and dealing with this?
Maybe I'll lead on this and say there isn't one single person responsible for this. I mean, if we really want to take on hate at a systemic level, then there are many different steps that need to be taken to address it. So breaking it down to its component parts, I mean, I think any of you who have worked with me here will know that one of the biggest things I'm advocating for is online harms legislation, which hopefully will be finally reintroduced in the new year. And that's because at a systemic level, we need the companies that are, and now it was social media, but now what we're seeing is they've continued to consolidate power and their AI platforms, put in place certain safety measures to at least risk manage some of what is facilitated through their products and services. I think that is number one on my list. But we need various different ways that we need to be addressing this, whether it is improving the media ecosystem and kind of proving trust. We need guardrails, obviously, on AI. I think it can be in online harms legislation, but we also need to be looking again at strengthening privacy laws and AI laws. Again, I will say I'm falling back on the legal solutions here, so there is so much more beyond law that we should be looking at to address this.
Quickly, Emily, of course, you are right. We need law to regulate this, and of course, that comes from the government. So the government should be at the forefront of this regulation. Secondly, the corporations developing these tools should always be conscious of the harm this tool poses and try to address that harm at the design stage, not just at the design stage, but also when the tool has been deployed. Because one thing about AI is that the AI that leaves the factory is total from the AI when it starts operating, because AI learns from data. Very good example we gave is Tay. It learns from data, and it may suddenly develop some skills that was not originally anticipated when it was designed. So developers of these tools should be conscious of this, the harm at the design and also when the tool is deployed. Then, of course, institutions and researchers like me, this is also where we come in, being able to conduct this research, identify these harms, and make it, public out there for people to get to know. Then, importantly, you have civil groups as well as public interest groups, and that is where almost everybody here, as well as those joining us online, comes in, because, most of us come from one group or the other. The fact is this: AI has a very wide impact on diverse groups. So the homework for you as a representative of any group here is to go back and start researching the group you represent. How does artificial intelligence technology impact that group? And I can assure you one way or the other it does. You have to be conscious of that and make contribution when the regulation is in place so that you can be able to speak for your group. So that's also another important, of course, and of course the end users themselves who use this tool, when you identify those harms, don't just ignore them, report them to the developers also, and sometimes also make them public.
Eamon, do you want to address this point?
I think like my fellow panelists covered that very well, but maybe two more comments on the kind of designers of these tools. I feel like it's important for them to incorporate like different stakeholders at the design stage, especially minorities. Going back to that Pepequan example, when we were using earlier version of ChatGPT, we realized that it tries to minimize the trauma that Indigenous people went through, and it tried to make it sound like there are two sides to the story, and everyone was struggling. And it's you soon realize just because the designers of these tools did not have Indigenous community representation when they were designing that, and it was like an after the fact thing. So that's at the designer level, but then at the individual level, we also hold some responsibilities to educate ourselves about like this new technology and how to use it and how it's impacting us. And so we talked about the ability to differentiate hate speech from not hate speech, like something that's generated by AI versus something that's generated by a human. Having that skill will become more and more important, and that's at the individual level, education becomes essential.
I think we are pressed for time, so I don't know that we have time for a question. Are there any audience questions? Can't even see.
Yeah, we do have some, Ian, on our handy cue cards here.
Okay.
We are seeing a rise of youth hate, especially online. What are some policy solutions?
I think that one of the key ways that we need to be looking at that is, I start from the basis that we need to be looking at what their interactions are online. One of the things I didn't get into is this soft forms of radicalization that we're seeing, right? Everything is, when I talked about memes, everything is just set out as just a joke. It's not really hate, it's just a ha ha ha, and then creates a sense of belonging and a sense of outsiders. And what is being seen in the online ecosystem is basically this softening of these approaches, and a little bit of content is pushed and a little bit more, and they're so vulnerable to being exploited, and their brains are developing that they are easily impacted, and it's rewiring their minds in particular ways. So that's partly why we're seeing this polarization at the level of youth. So what do we do about it? I think there's been work at critical thinking skills at a youth level. We could debate or not debate all the solutions that have been put on the table. Having kids off of social media, should we ban it for under 16s? That's controversial. Ooh, should we start age verification mechanisms so that they have a more curated space online? Well, that also creates controversial points, but that is the sort of where a lot of the discussion is happening here to try to address and combat that.
The next question is, as we go back to the various communities we are part of, what kinds of conversations around AI and misinformation should we be having at the grassroots? What best practices can we encourage our communities to adopt, especially our youth?
Go ahead.
Okay, so when it comes to I think the important thing, education is very important. We are living in an era of deepfake where you can hardly distinguish between what is real and what is fake. It's very important. While we wait for, I'm not in the technical aspect of things to be able to profile, okay, this is the solution as to how to differentiate these two. I don't have that skill as a lawyer. But the fact is that these things are out there. So it's very important for people to know that it's not everything you see online that is real. There are deepfake content there that may look so real, but they are not real. That education, being able to verify, take additional steps to verify what you see. Don't just click on that YouTube suggested link and then you see it and you start sending it out to thousands of links, in a list serve. Verify, at least take some additional steps to verify the accuracy of that content before you begin to share, so that you do not ignorantly become a part in amplification of hate crime or for misinformation or disinformation online.
Can I add also trust, I think, is one of the key ones too, that what are the building blocks of trust? And we need to be starting with our youth. And it is, there's a real erosion of trust in institutions and trust in government. There's an erosion of trust in media. And so building up that sense of trust in community starts really at an individual level. And the Shelley Guy Bajaj is someone who does a lot of work in this area. not from a legal perspective. And she's talked about how really it is about getting into the communities themselves. I mean, if you want to deal with the problems on WeChat, then some law against it and that is not going to deal with that. You know, just reinforces the lack of trust in the institutions, but getting into the communities and forming those relationships, that takes a long time, but it also is probably the most effective.
Eamon, do you want to speak to that as well?
Maybe one more thing is, like, you know, we can start to think about how can we be part of the story in shaping AI instead of just like being users of AI. And I mean, again, I go back to the Pepe example. I really like that initiative because they took the time to actually think, okay, we want to be part of the story. We want to be not just users, but how can we generate like the right data to be able to tell our own stories? So, you know, like, think about like what's the data that you want to put out there that represent your community, and how can you, you know, get it to be part of the AI story.
Okay, I think we've hit the end of the line in terms of the questions. Well, once again, we'll have a slide of helpful resources and links, and most importantly, I want to thank our panelists, Emily, Eamon, and Gideon for these insights today, and a lot to take with you as you leave today. Thank you very much. As before, I'll take a moment to sort of talk about very quickly summarize some of the issues that we've heard today about, I mean, I guess one interesting point is that we cannot be passive in the face of AI, that, you know, we can't wait for this to just come out of the blue, but I think it was the point that Gideon made, to get in there and to see how it affects the organizations you're involved with. I guess how it affects Canadians in general, and you know, to learn about this device that's certainly on our smartphones and literally in our pockets and at hand in our lives. There's the sense, I guess, that Canada has to strike a balance between the speed of AI innovation and online safety, especially in the area of AI bots and algorithms, and that we need investments and action on education and awareness to combat misinformation and the spread of racism by AI. One observation we have, as you heard, there is an AI minister, Minister Solomon. The Prime Minister is mindful of AI, I think, as a tool for, you know, the economy and society and such, but it probably wouldn't hurt for Canadians to, you know, assertively get into that discussion, to sort of make their views known and to be part of the discussion and to take this in a way that you think is appropriate given some of the concerns you've heard here today. And I think that I'll leave it at that. But also we did hear that AI can be used for good. This is a tool that's a risky tool, but it can be used for good. Now at this point, I'm looking at our schedule here. I think the thinking was for you to take a break and to come back after 5 minutes before we wrap things up. It's a stretch your legs break, that's it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for holding on to your stretching for a couple of minutes. We're gonna just reconvene here, and I think we have a couple of last few remarks that we're just gonna finish off, and then we're gonna finish off the day. So, first of all, thank you very, 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 very much. I want to start just by acknowledging and appreciating our knowledge keeper, Cameron Crowchild, who has so generously given us his time and wisdom and set a grounding to this conversation that was very important. So thank you so much for being here with us. I want to give a big shout out to my team. There's so many people that were involved in the creation of this, both here and back home, and all our places across Canada that have worked on this, so thank you so much. We would like to thank, on behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, our board of directors, Teresa Wupa, Anne-Marie Pham, and Roy Pokozelsky are in the room, and many of them are also joining online, so thank you also for being here too. And to our partners at the Globe and Mail, Willow, Ian, and the entire staff with Amy at the Globe and Mail. My name is Mohammed Hashim. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Thank you, that's very kind of you. But I also actually just, first before I get into my remarks, this is the fourth iteration of this conversation. And we try to bring national conversations into a local lens. And I gotta tell you, we've had this conversation in Toronto, we've had it in Montreal, but being out west over here has certainly an extremely different flavor to it. But the degree of urgency that I'm hearing, not just from the panelists, but from the participants over here of where the state of this nation is going, is something that is really sitting heavy with me because, maybe I sometimes sit in a bubble when I live in Toronto, which is, a different place than here. It's true. I want to begin my remarks by just identifying a common theme that I think I've heard across all the panels today. And that is that, when we think about public policy, it can't just be about people in Ottawa or Edmonton or Toronto thinking about public policy, that the impacts of such are felt by all of us, and that there needs to be a high degree of rigor both towards the data that informs public policy, but the shared experiences that we have in the room across this country that are coming from very diverse perspectives. Canada is a multicultural country. That is not an ideal, that is a fact. And how we react to that fact needs to be the inclusion of all of that multicultural knowledge and beauty and vision into the perspectives. So whether we're talking about how we're managing fire to make sure that people who have lived on this land for thousands of years, who know the land, can manage the land, have done so for years and years and years and years, lead the conversation and how that management needs to happen, is critical to how we inform policy in a way that's going to respond to the actual needs of people who are packing 40 pounds of stuff in a bag and running for their lives in moments when their lives are in complete danger. And that we're also at a time right now where, without taking that approach, where we're walking into, maybe even sleepwalking into a future that looks kind of crazy. And I don't know what it's going to look like, to be frank, because what we heard today was, and the last panel in particular, was really, really scary. But in the continuum of Canada, I just want to zoom out a little bit and think about this. We talked about immigration in the beginning of the day. And for the last 30 years or so, there's been a relative consensus on immigration. We saw people on the left support it at about 70%, and people on the right support it at about 60%. That was a national consensus for the last 30 years. So I think it was earlier last year, in 2024, we saw polling that people on the left were still at 70%, but people on the right were sitting at about 15 to 20% in terms of support for additional immigration. And, there's a lot of factors that play into it. And, people talked about sharing misinformation and how AI generation is actually having an impact in terms of what we see collectively. I mean, this is a terrible example, but does anyone remember the story about, Indians pooping on the beach? Yeah? Everybody heard about this, right? That was a visceral image that was shared prolifically online. And it was shared as fact. And the mayor of Wasaga Beach was just like, what are you talking about? This is not real. But it was being shared as fact. Now, did that have any impact on South Asians? I would say yes. Did that have an impact on immigration consensus? I would say yes. Because what Ian shared earlier today was that that national consensus is broken about more immigration. And now the fact is that now, and I'm not saying it's all because of that one image and people going off about it, but I'm saying an AI-generated image fueled on social media, traveling faster than any word of you and I sharing across multiple mediums will have far more destructive impact than anything you and I could say in the moment right now. And I say that because, you know, right across the country, we're seeing the guardrails that protected democracy fall. We're seeing the institutions and the lack of trust in institutions continuously be eroded. To be frank, I would never have thought that the notwithstanding clause would be used to ban bike lanes or the right for trans people to live the way they want to. But we're in a state now where the democratic values and the pillars that we held as our Constitution are being used in ways that were never imaginable. A few weeks ago, we got a briefing from the head of the RCMP for the Toronto Central region, and they were telling us about, and this is answering your question, Ian, about what keeps you up at night, a 13-year-old girl who killed her 7-year-old brother because she was part of an online community that goaded her to do so. And I point to that now because I think that, you know, all the stuff that we're seeing in the ecosystem around online behavior and the lack of regulation in the space, like, let's be frank here. You can't drive at 200 kilometers an hour because we know what safety on the road looks like. You gotta wear a seatbelt because we know what safety looks like. You can't watch horrific content on TV at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when kids are coming back from school, but we can hand them an iPad. And sometimes, honestly, as a parent, we have to hand them the iPad because we're busy trying to just live and get food on the table and get food ready. So that's a reality. But that iPad is an entry point for a lot of things and a lot of impacts and a lot of thoughts and a lot of beliefs that are completely unmitigated. And I think that's a public policy opportunity. Emily pointed towards this too. Like the necessity for us to look at experiences online, define what safety looks like, define what privacy looks like, and define what the usage of that space actually looks like before it gets completely out of control. But the best part about my job, and I'm giving you the horror stories of many of the things that we have to look at. But honestly, like I've been in this role for 5 years now, and I've traveled this entire country. And as much as I hear the difficulties for people everywhere, I actually believe today more than any other day that when Canadians work together, when we are true in our desire for reconciliation, and when we're true to each other, we can find incredible courage and beauty, and we can actually change societies together. And I'll give you just one story, because this one was very impactful to me. Earlier this year, I got an email from the auntie in Saskatoon, because the city of Saskatoon actually has a job title named auntie. It's true. She works in the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls office. Like, it's part of their TRC commitment. And so she messaged me. She's like, "You need to show up to our residential school survivors walk." So I said, "Okay, I'm gonna come, because if the auntie calls, you know what you do? You go." We all have those aunties. You know what I'm talking about. And so I went there, and honestly, it was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. It's organized by the city and community groups in collaboration. There's a walk that is led by survivors who sit on golf carts, and then behind them is about 5,000 kids with orange shirts. They empty out the entire schools for this, and you walk along the South Saskatchewan River in this path, and along it you see Indigenous dancers, but you also see Bhangra dancers, you see Japanese drummers, you see every type of community. You see Chinese traditional dancers, you see singers from every single culture from across this country who are there to bring joy to the survivors. And it's not a moment of, it's a recognition not just that the responsibility for reconciliation sits upon one group or the other, it's that we all have to do it. And we all have to approach it with a place of joy. Because that's what's going to get us into the belief of seeing each other wholly. And after that, I got an email from one of the organizers, and she said, this year was particularly impactful for me because my dad was a residential school survivor. And when he was there, an 11-year-old boy came up to him and gave him a birthday card. And he said, "Why are you giving me a birthday card?" And the kid said, it was for all the birthdays that they didn't celebrate in residential schools. So he holds that card next to him at his house. But that kid demonstrated what all of our responsibility is by one act. Because we can hold difficult truths and each other up and pull each other up. That's what I want to count on. That's the Canada that I believe in. And it's a difficult time, and I get it. There's a lot of backlash against EDI, and there's a lot of backlash about everything else. But the only thing that's going to get us all together, forward, is being together. So this is an invitation from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to all of you, to the 1,000 people that are online watching this, that we want to work with you to build a better Canada that's for everybody. And that includes policy decisions, that includes community supports, that includes you as part of the solution. So with that, I'll say thank you very much for attending, and I'll turn it over to our wonderful board chair, Teresa Wupa, for some final remarks. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. Thank you to the team for bringing us together on this very important subject. May I suggest, Mohammed, before I forget, next time can we do a draw so that I don't have to always follow you, such a hard act to follow, so that maybe I have a chance to speak before you next time. So thank you for this opportunity to speak to you very briefly. I'm between you and the reception on your way home or the airport. But I've been given this opportunity, and I have a tendency to take the slightly more challenged option. So I'm going to, I was asked to share a bit of reflection. So I've been making notes and trying to organize it while I was making notes, listening to the speakers. So I may give you a bit of a depressed reflection, but hopefully at the end, it would be something that's positive for us all. So first, thank you to Knowledge Keeper Cameron for sharing all that you have today with all of us. And great to see so many friends and colleagues and partners here today, right here in my kind of hometown, Calgary, 53 years. Yes. One of my notes here is I used to have to go to Ontario to get inspiration about doing, anti-discrimination, anti-racism work. But today, I find that I got inspiration right here in Calgary, Alberta. So thank you to all of you and all the people who organized today's very important conversation. So I think that in terms of reflection, I think that it's very clear to all of us. So many of you have been doing this work you do it day in, day out, many of you, for a very long time. So we are kind of reminded today that systemic racism exists in many, if not all, facets of life here in Canada. And so it's woven into the structures and our institutions. We heard it from immigration and technology, the environment, relief management. So I think that that was a good reminder that that's why this is such a big issue, because it's structural. So reflection, having worked for decades on issues of equity and justice here in Canada and across Canada, so I was reminded that change is never linear. So I cannot help but, because like some of you in the room, this is a proposal season. My background is social work, so I was also working on some proposals. And, so combined with what I've been hearing today, I attended the first cross-cultural training program for police for police here in Calgary in 1986. I was doing an interview with CRIAC. For those in Calgary, you know CRIAC, right? They provide mentorship to immigrants. So I was doing an interview just 2 days ago, and I pulled out a report for the interviewer on how the government of Alberta recognized the need to address foreign credential. And that was written in 1992. So, and then I was reminded today that, I did an interview 15, 20 years ago by one of the radio stations here in Calgary about, the last name starts with R. Anyway, so he said that to me 20 years ago here in Calgary, aren't you using the R word too frequently here in Calgary? And so last night I was flipping the book called The Color of Democracy, that talk about racism in policing, racism in justice system, racism in governments, racism in health, and racism in education, racism in social services. And that was written in the 1990s, 200, and I was flipping it last night, and I have to tell you, it's still relevant today. So I think that, so it is hard for me to say that solutions are within reach. But I have to say, after listening to our panelists and talking to many of you here today, that I am encouraged, and I continue to be hopeful. And so because I learned more about the Black justice strategy today. I heard that I saw Caitlin as a leader in an important institution, addressing issues in justice, especially for Indigenous women. I see different people in the room, different people having conversation. The conversation is different. So I have to say that we are making improvement, even though the path, the journey have been challenging and difficult. So I'm glad to say that I'm seeing improvement and change because of the passion that you all carry, the commitment that you carry, and also the hope that we'll work together moving forward. If I may, lastly, to respond to something Francis said about power. And so there's organization like the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, using power of information and knowledge, power of precision, access to influence. But I would also like to say and reinforce that we also have power here, power of people, power of the voices of those impacted, and power of number when we work together. And when I think the institutions, policies, decision-making, and they actually work with the people who are impacted adversely at the moment by those decisions, I think that I think it will just speed up the process of change and what is needed to do in the interest of the people, especially those who are impacted. So thank you. I'm grateful for your participation and contribution to the success of today's event. Thank you for your presence, your energy, and your commitment. Safe travels home, and may the conversation begun here ripple onwards into lasting systemic change. Thank you so very much.
I just want to say that when I opened up earlier, I forgot to translate a few words in the language. So what I meant was the circle of life. There's the yellow man, the black man, the white man. They're going to come to this country in the future, and we're here. And it's up to the red man to teach them those 4 laws. That's what our elders talk about. And that's that circle that we have. And it's the circle of life. So with that, I'll say a closing prayer for us, that we all learn and work together, because that's what it's about. To help one another in the Blackfoot language. And we'll have a good travel home. Ayaho, etanis agalak, maguta, tistit na klata, titanaka, tsuaka, klata dinatis gashe it, sudina it dinate. The people to go home on a nice ride, safe journey, to help all the people. Ekahala, dinatis gashe, and the yellow people, and the red people, and the white people, and all the people in this world. We thank you for this day, Creator, Nata, Niskaglaka, and we all work together to make this a nice, safe place, good country. Hey, Siskas, Megwich.